From frame 1 of getting control of Cloud, I couldn't stop being mesmerized by Rebirth. I sincerely believe it is beautiful. This becomes even more apparent as we make the trek up Nebo Mountain. The way the light bends down onto the road while we walk with Sephiroth and Tifa up the trail culminates the scene into a perfect encapsulation of Seven's beauty. All this, with the fully orchestrated overworld theme playing on top of it, is enough to give me chills. Nearly every combination of scenery, characters, story, and music all blend together into individual moments that can hardly be described as anything but gorgeous, which makes this viewing of Cloud's memory feel as perfect as he probably believes it to be in his head. And it also makes me curious as to how this will be recalled again in the next game. The entirety of Rebirth has been crafted with a vision of bringing the world of Final Fantasy VII to life with breathtaking detail. My appreciation for this world only grew with each building I entered and every cliff that I climbed. Just walking through Calm for the first time, seeing the town activities and how much effort was dedicated to every corner stunned me. Every nook and cranny of each city in Rebirth has a story to tell, from heartbroken men to starving artists and kids turning into toads. Then there's exploring the overworld of Rebirth, which has become something else entirely. It's littered with a seemingly endless amount of things to do. The infinite void of random battles has been replaced with fewer, less random ones, as well as little tasks to complete everywhere. Each region feels unique with its own charm and has its own fitting arrangement of the overworld theme. And despite it just being a variation on the same melody, nearly every tune feels brand new. Yet some notes stay the same. While Remake and Rebirth look and feel completely different to play from the original, it does try to tell the same story, with changes of course. But I find that nearly every change Square made in respects to the story, at least for Rebirth, is good. Again, nearly. There's some that I'm really on the fence about. But when it comes to some of the more intimate dialogue we get between party members, these changes and additions are gladly welcomed. For instance, let's go back to the moment in Calm where Cloud is recalling his memories. This is essentially where Rebirth begins. Inside an inn, Cloud starts to tell a story about a mission with Sephiroth. This story explains how he went from war hero to the man who single-handedly burnt down Tifa in Cloud's village. In the original, after Cloud finishes this story, Tifa doesn't mention for a long time that their memories don't line up. Yet in Rebirth, it is brought up almost immediately. This is a huge and incredibly important change for the characters and their development, although it doesn't really change the plot at all, at least not that we know of yet. Even still, I like this a lot. It feels way more realistic that Tifa would mention that their memories differ much sooner. And what makes this feel even more genuine is that she brings her concerns to Aerith first. These kind of details make the characters feel far more believable, as well as create a more interesting dynamic in the story. They also don't let it go after bringing it up the first time. It comes back and affects their actions and feelings towards each other time and time again. Maybe a little excessively in some moments, but it's done well enough. Or honestly, maybe it's just refreshing to see some kind of interesting conflict between characters after playing through 16. Although there are some changes within Rebirth that I absolutely loathe, such as when Cait Sith gets removed from our party for a significant chunk of the game. I don't necessarily hate the idea of removing party members for a little bit. In fact, it happens all the time throughout the game and it's usually a good thing. Although it's usually for a much shorter period of time, so I really hate this extended loss of a single party member, partially because it just doesn't feel justified. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself and I'll come back to this later. Instead, let's get back to the story. Shortly after Tifa decides that she should bring up her concerns to Cloud about their memory mismatch, Cloud steps in first to ask Tifa how in the world is she alive. He could have sworn that she was dead in the moment Sephiroth swung at her. This surprises Tifa as she probably didn't expect to have her own concerns be pushed down by what are now far more insidious ones. Tifa seems pretty disturbed that Cloud may not even believe she's real. I know I just said I like this because it brings some actual conflict to the group, and I still do, but I'm a little torn about how it plays out. I think it does make sense here knowing that, spoiler, Cloud's memories aren't exactly perfect in his retelling of the Nebo reactor incident, and it makes sense with this whole puppet of Sephiroth thing. I just don't know how much I like that part of it. It's probably because I don't feel like Cloud is the kind of guy to bring this sort of thing up to someone. I guess it's explained away by his hallucinations of Sephiroth manipulating him. Yet something feels off because it still feels a little out of character for Cloud to mention something like that despite the influence from Sephiroth. Usually he keeps any concerns, thoughts, or feelings pretty bottled up unless it's really important to the current mission. Although at the same time, this does play really well into the idea that Cloud's character is a walking contradiction. Cloud puts on this persona of being a strong-willed and not letting anything get in the way of his objectives kind of guy. But here we see Cloud's true character show for a bit, one that is a little more weak-minded and doubting everything he knows, thus letting Sephiroth manipulate his emotions completely, and it's on full display here. So what really has me torn is that I wanted to see Tifa be able to confront Cloud on his memories and see the aftermath of that, but she didn't actually get to despite being so close. This situation still creates tension, but not necessarily for the reasons I wanted. All in all, I don't think it's bad. In fact, it ends up making perfect sense for Cloud's character, but I don't think I like it as much as I would the other scenario where Cloud is being challenged on his memories. Especially considering I think this would still play well into him doubting himself and showing he actually has a bit of weakness. Although my largest annoyance with the changes is that when Square switches things up like they do with Cloud and Tifa, it makes me feel as if there's this weird metagame going on between those who know the story and the writers of Rebirth. It's this strange back and forth with the changes where Square is saying, I know some of you probably know, but if we do this, do you still actually know? But we wouldn't actually change that, or would we? Who knows? Anyone else who has played the original before playing Rebirth has probably felt this awkward tension. It feels like we're being deliberately misdirected only for things to end up mostly the same. Anyways, after this dramatic scene between Cloud and Tifa, we run around the city of Kalm a bit to prepare for our journey to hunt down Sephiroth. Eventually, Cloud and Aerith end up on this little clock tower date. But Shinra forces suddenly arrive and fly down into the city to try and capture us. Luckily, the owner of the inn we stayed at knows who we are and decides to help us escape the city. That sure is convenient. This whole moment just feels a bit overdramatic. It's maybe another one of the few changes I'm not in love with. I just don't think it flowed very well to throw us out of Kalm like this. I also don't know if it even makes sense for the party to be so brazenly hunted down by Shinra. Especially considering they have a whole separate secret task force for that, the Turks. And ultimately, I just like the calmer transition that happens in the original. It still would have worked great here. Instead, it sort of feels like we should be on the run because Shinra is hunting the party down. But there's no actual reason to do that because we're not being chased. Instead, we're free to run around the grasslands and do as we please while facing no interference from anyone. So I just feel that a calmer transition would have gotten that idea across a lot better. In fact, I think this transition, where we go from the more linear gameplay of Remake into the semi-open world freedom of Rebirth, might be the worst designed part of the game. And now I feel like I'm being the overdramatic one because it's not that bad, but I do think this is Rebirth's largest issue, and here's why. When we step out of the sewers of Kalm into the grasslands, I feel like this transition is meant to show how free we are, from escaping Midgar and Shinra into a whole brand new world. Except we don't really get to interact with this newfound freedom in any way for a while. Despite being in a more free play scenario, we aren't actually allowed to do any of these activities in the open world until we follow a very specific linear path. These ideas completely contradict each other, and it's frustrating to play through when you don't understand the game just yet. One of the very first things I decided to do when I got here was run around and explore the open world. But it didn't take long for me to realize that it looks like there's a lot of things to do here, but for some reason I can't do any of it. I ran up a tower but couldn't interact with it in any meaningful way. I found a giant crystal cave that I was led to by some sort of shimmering rock, but there was still nothing to do. I found a lot of places that seemed to have a reason for being there, but for the life of me I couldn't figure out why. For a second, I thought the open world was just empty and boring and that there was literally nothing for me to actually do. Until I found more and more similar structures and I realized I must be missing something. What I didn't know is that I had to get a chocobo first to meet Chadley, who would then give me a tool to make all these activities available to do. Although I did find the Chocobo Ranch, it was before the story wanted me to be there, so it was closed off and I couldn't go in. That's when I finally gave up on exploring and went to the quest marker on my map. And the very next thing that was asked of me was to go to the ranch I was just at. This made me fairly concerned for the rest of Rebirth because to me this was a huge mistake. Although I'm happy to report these worries were almost completely unfounded. Still, the situation felt like torture to go through. I just don't understand why Square sent us out into the world without the tools to explore it first. It just doesn't make any sense. They could have easily had a section here after Calm where Chadley stops us in our tracks and explains he needs us to gather data about the world. I think this would have made for a much better transition into the semi-open world gameplay experience. I even think this kind of cutscene in the middle of being hunted down by Shinra, where Chadley just shows up for a chat out of nowhere, would have fit in with the vibes of Rebirth pretty well. Like, we just escaped from being captured by Shinra, how did you find us, and what in the world do you want from me? On top of that, the Chocobo Ranch being closed off before this quest doesn't feel good. I guess they just really want to make sure that we see this cutscene they put in at the dock. But I don't feel as if it was worth it. Some players are going to find a Chocobo Ranch first, and others are going to run as fast as they can to the quest marker on their screen. And showing up to this closed ranch only to backtrack to it immediately is incredibly annoying. I mean, I was just here. If I had to guess why Square did it this way, it was only to make the distinction between the things we have to do and what is optional more clear. Because if Chadley were to appear right after Calm and then give players a ton of markers on our map with things to do, many players might end up thinking they need to do all of these things before moving on, or just forget that the main quest exists at all. It's the only thing I can think of as to why Square would do it the way they did. While I have no idea what the best design here is, it certainly can't be this, because what I do know is that being allowed to run around the world but not do any of the open world activities feels really bad. Fortunately, this is a one-time problem, and again, the rest of the experience is far smoother. I didn't find hiccups anywhere as close to as bad as this one in the rest of the game. As far as the open world activities themselves go, for the most part, they're a typical run here and press a button to make something happen kind of event. There's a few special ones that are fun, but they are far and few in between. All in all, these are certainly the weakest link of Rebirth. It's what I was leaving out when I said this game is almost everything I wanted out of a modern JRPG. Because the bulk of what is tasked of us in this side content, if you can call it that, will be finding a radio tower or a crystal, interacting with it for less than 10 seconds, and then moving on to the next one. The exploration to find the objects tends to be the bulkier part of it, except there's no real exploration because your map tells you exactly where to go. In fact, this highly detailed map ruins this part of the game for me. If I was instead tasked with exploring everything on my own and the map slowly uncovered as I reach certain places, I think that would be a lot more enjoyable. It'd feel much more like I'm discovering something. Instead, we already know where everything is. We simply just need to go there and then do it. And maybe if these objectives were a little more fun, it would be okay, but they're pretty boring. Climbing up a tower to press a button isn't exactly exhilarating gameplay. Although, like I said, some of these are good. For example, the proto-relics. These are special missions that differ between all the regions. They are basically their own complete side story with quests. A few of them even have their own mini-games attached to them that are pretty fun and even come with a hard mode. These are the tasks that are the most worthy of your time, so if you're going to do any world activities, certainly take part in the proto-relics. So while I don't totally love the gameplay of the open world, there's certainly something to be said about having Final Fantasy VII be totally fleshed out. I think this was a pretty clear goal of Square's. They didn't want another overworld, they wanted something more realized. The problem is that this leaves a lot of empty space, which has been filled with these open world activities. The world they've created does look fantastic, but most of the things you do in it, not so much. I think I could have gone the entire game without participating in a single world activity besides the proto-relics, and my overall experience would have been more positive. I understand Square's objective is to make a fully realized world, but I wonder if the game is better for it or not. Especially if you consider a more simple overworld would drastically reduce the development time and its costs. Part of my problem here is that when creating a world like this, it's hard to think of any other way to make it fun besides making the core gameplay loop focused on exploration and progressing because of that exploration. While you can explore 7th World, you hardly earn much of anything for doing it. And as I've already mentioned, when all of the exploring has already been done for you, it feels far less rewarding to do it. It feels like Square made two different games here that weren't well meshed together. One game being the main story of Final Fantasy VII, and the other an open-world exploration game. Except, clearly, the main story is the favorite child, while the open world exists almost just for the sake of it. Because most of what there is to do in this open world is incredibly boring, there's no discoveries or exciting things to find. There's no special materia you can get by exploring the corner of some random cave or behind a waterfall that's being guarded by difficult enemies. Instead, you're tasked with turning on towers and researching crystals to earn Chadley bucks. And after earning enough, then you're rewarded with the materia. I think this delay of gratifying rewards makes this experience feel more fruitless than it already does. Exploring in Elden Ring is fun because behind any corner could be a cool new powerful weapon, a spell, a boss, or at least a way to upgrade your current gear. That's what makes exploration feel fun to do. You're discovering something, you're getting something for it, but there's hardly any kind of similar incentive for doing the same in Rebirth. It's like they designed this to be an efficient system for an MMO rather than a game where you're being rewarded for exploration. Getting Chadley bucks just makes me think of doing 10 different daily activities or dungeons to get a currency in order to buy a weapon upgrade. This kind of system feels pretty bogus in a supposed AAA game that wants to reward you for exploring its world. I hope Square moves away from this and finds better ways to design exploration in their next installment of this trilogy. That said, something about the open world that does feel good right away are the new ways in which Cloud can move around. Simply sprinting into an obstacle will typically allow Cloud to hop, skip, and jump over it effortlessly or just push it away. This is a huge improvement from the movement in Remake, and it already felt pretty fun just to run into something and push it around in that game. The best is when there are chairs everywhere. I suddenly turned into a demon known as the Chair Terrorist, a chairist if you will. And luckily for me, Square was sure to give me a plethora of chairs in Rebirth to terrorize as well. One of the largest praises I can give Rebirth for this design is that the movement typically feels congruent within the environment I was in and where I want to go. That is to say, I hardly ever felt like I should be able to go somewhere but cannot due to the limitations of the movement system. I think this is an incredibly impressive feat, as this can be a very difficult thing to pull off well. The movement you're allowed to do and the design of the world seem to mostly be in harmony with each other. With a world and scope this large, I'm sure I could nitpick a few spots where it feels like I should probably be able to get there, but these are likely going to be places where you don't need to go anyways. The point is that it's not a consistent problem that worsens the experience. On the contrary, Square could have easily given Cloud a Breath of the Wild-like climbing ability. While this would unleash the player to explore however they choose, that's not exactly what Rebirth is all about. The traversal of this game is more designed around giving little hints to objectives and making us wonder, how do we get there? This can make the exploration in the game feel more like a puzzle and give a more tailored experience overall, which I tend to like a lot in games. While being able to explore completely freely in something like Breath of the Wild can be fun, having a little more direction in moments, even if it's just a choice between two paths, can be freeing in its own way, one that frees us of indecision. Too many options all the time can be a bit overwhelming, while just a few may let players better carve out a path in their head before they proceed. I think that Rebirth finds a pretty good balance in this sort of decision making. Still, something that many might consider a problem with this kind of design is that when you can climb, how is that communicated? The solution used in Rebirth is often referred to as yellow tape, and this is introduced to us from the very first climb in Nibelheim. Now, a lot of people believe that yellow tape is bad or lazy, usually in part because it doesn't look very good, maybe they don't feel like it's natural, immersive, or whatever else. And yeah, it doesn't always look great, but I don't think it's that big of an issue. Yellow tape can be good design because the advantages far outweigh how much it sticks out of the environment. And in fact, Final Fantasy games have been using yellow tape right under players' noses throughout the entire series, although it wasn't always yellow. In many JRPGs, chests tend to stick out of the environment like a guy wearing a full suit of armor walking through New York City, so it's difficult for me to see how this is any different from painting the climbable walls in Rebirth yellow. Since when are people leaving behind brightly colored chests all over the world with valuable treasure in them? It's not a question most would ask because I don't think hardly anyone sees it as an actual issue. And the reason for this in large part is because we are rewarded for finding the chest. But beyond that, it's good design in other ways. Sometimes it needs to stick out so it's more obvious that there is a reward nearby. For example, instead of putting materia in a chest, Square often plainly places this important item as itself on the ground, letting the player think, oh dope, there's some new materia, let's go get it. And this is made even more clear in the newer games where there is a bright shining beacon shooting from the top of these items. This is pretty equivalent to yellow paint in my mind, but I don't see anyone complaining about it. I personally like this a lot because I'm the exact kind of blind dummy that would miss the important items like this otherwise. So I have to imagine that some people are upset about yellow paint only because it doesn't lead to an immediate reward. Oftentimes, climbing can lead players to a place where a reward is, or just a new area they've yet to explore, but that isn't quite as satisfying as seeing a new weapon or whatever else pop into your inventory from opening the brightly colored chest. Although this goes beyond rewards, because when you're in an environment with constrained and more restricted paths like Rebirth, some sort of indicator to show where players can climb is not only a good thing, it's a necessary thing. In fact, Expedition 33 uses this same exact technique and even further improves it by making the controller vibrate when you get near a place where you can use a grappling hook. I think this design is genius. It doesn't feel intrusive or like it doesn't belong, and it just makes sense. The best case I can make for yellow paint in Rebirth is a quest where we need to find a cactuar statue hidden somewhere in the desert. The game gives us a tool that shines a beam of light towards them in order to help us navigate to it. But for this final shrine, it's not very useful because there's a huge wall blocking our line of sight to the shrine. I traveled through every area I knew of to see if I somehow missed a pathway, but finally came to the conclusion that I needed a better look at the place. After finding a plateau that let me see the area more as a whole, I finally spotted it. The yellow paint on the wall where I could climb to reach the hidden area. This already took me quite a while, so I can't imagine if these little climbing nodes were more blended into the environment. If I had to slowly survey the entirety of the wall inch by inch until I could finally make out where these little climbing nubs were, I think I'd go crazy. That said, there is a sweet spot for the amount of direction players are given. It can be fun to explore a game and try to figure out how to get to the next destination, even if that just means talking to a bunch of NPCs in town to get some clues. I think the original did this well in many places. For example, after leaving Midgar, we'll eventually find the crew needing to cross a swamp. But if they try, a giant snake will start chasing them down, so then players have a couple of options. Find a strategy to kill it, which will likely require a lot of grinding, or explore for another way. For those who like to grind or figure out strategies to overcome insurmountable odds, they might find this challenge to be pretty fun. But I imagine most will probably explore and see if there's another way to cross the swamp. By doing so, they'll eventually venture into the Chocobo farm. Here we can meet Bill and he'll explain that the swamp can be safely crossed while riding one of these giant birds. I personally like this kind of thing a lot. It gives the players options, a reason to explore the world, and a mystery to uncover. That said, there's also really bad instances of this happening in the original, such as players getting lost while trying to find the ancient temple. This place can be pretty confusing to find on your own, and there's only a single guy in the whole world that will mention its location, and all he has to say is, it's far south of here. I should mention the guy who says this, and the only one I found, is quite literally on the complete opposite side of the world from this ancient temple. I feel like the guy could have been a little more explicit in saying it's at the most southern region of the map. Instead, I wandered the world for around an hour because south of him is literally the entire map. So what I'm trying to say is that yellow tape is the shortcut where the guy tells players it's all the way down south. It helps navigate players to where they're trying to go a little more explicitly. It's the tracks in the original that shows which areas have random battles where a chocobo can appear. Yellow paint makes it so players aren't tied down to running around like an idiot and guessing where to go by carefully examining every crevice of every surface. or doing something as silly as mapping out the exact pixel of where a chocobo can spawn, or talking to every single NPC until one of them finally vaguely alludes to where you should go next. Yellow paint is a tool to avoid wasting a player's time where the devs think it shouldn't, and I appreciate that. All that said, I do think there is probably a better balance that exists between a player exploring to find a solution versus putting yellow tape in their face. Because, as I mentioned, there is value in not having guardrails all the time, such as choosing between fighting the snake or finding the chocobo farm. And I do think it's unfortunate that Rebirth removes this interaction. But it's not like yellow tape stops players from exploring completely. These concepts are not mutually exclusive. There were still plenty of moments within Rebirth where I had to do quite a bit of exploring to figure out where I was going, and having the knowledge that these yellow painted climbing rocks would likely lead me towards somewhere I needed to go helped make exploration a little less miserable. Back to where we left off in Rebirth, after we secure a chocobo from Bill's ranch and maybe do a few world activities, we can now cross the swamp to the Mithril Mines. Except they make you fight this snake anyways, unlike in the original. Either way, after a quick bout, the snake eats Cloud, and then he is unexpectedly saved by Sephiroth by way of him slicing the snake open underwater. Cool. This scene also confirms that indeed Sephiroth did do this, and then into the cave we go. I think the Mithril Mines is one of the best dungeons to showcase how much the remake team has improved their pacing and expanding of the story. For instance, one of my least favorite places they extended in the remake was the Haunted Train Yard. Both times I played through this section, it felt like it didn't add anything meaningful to the story, it went on too long, and overall it didn't feel worth my time. But I didn't feel that way for almost any mainline quest in Rebirth. I think one of the most important things they've done to alleviate some of the pacing issues is add these little breaks we get in between all of the fighting. Whether it's pushing a minecart around or maneuvering a giant Mako Roomba, or a Makumba as I like to call it. These kind of interactions sort of existed in Remake, but they often felt like gimmicks that got reused too often, like sliding along an edge or simply climbing something for a moment. The most unique interaction Remake had to offer was this crane puzzle, but that was maybe the most single awful experience I had in that game, so I'm happy to say nothing in Rebirth comes close to that. Overall, I think they nailed the interactions this time around and didn't make them feel too tedious or overused. I was sort of dreading my second playthrough of this game mostly because I knew it was going to take a while. Rebirth is a huge game, but I expected it to feel far more tedious to go through than it actually was. Almost every time I got to a new chapter, I was thinking that surely this will be when it gets boring, but instead I only found myself enjoying the game still. Back in the mines, I also thought I was going to have less fun when the party splits here. Red and Barrett end up as a duo, and it acts as a good opportunity to show us how these two interact with each other. And at least at this point, they seem to sort of hate each other. I don't understand how or why that happened. I guess their personalities are just a little conflicting. Maybe it's because Red is always making Barrett sleep on the couch. Who knows? Whatever the case, splitting them off from the group and watching them grow to like each other over the course of the game was a nice addition. After defeating a couple bosses, the party regroups and they come out the other side of the Mithril Mine into the region of Junon. At the cave's rear, we're immediately greeted with what I can only assume is a giant condor that effortlessly snatches up one of the cloaked men for a snack. It's a terrifying moment and introduces us to the new dangers that may await. Except, well, maybe not condors because we really only get to take a picture of one for a quest, but we do get to fight some other weird looking birds over the course of the game. Speaking of chickens, somewhat similar to how the chocobo colors in the original work, each region has its own variation of this bird with a unique mechanic that lets us explore the world in a new way. Junon's chocobo lets us scale walls, Gongagas let us bounce off giant mushrooms, Cosmo Canyons can glide for a while, Nibelheims can jet over water, while corals and the grasslands don't really do anything special and are just yellow. After wrangling the region's special chocobo at a nearby ranch, it's a short ride to Lower Junon, which is a poor town where hardly anything important happens. But there is a dolphin riding minigame, the goal of which is to perform a ridiculous leap over an electrified tower to lower and raise a ship so our crew can sneak into the much more important Upper Junon. After a successful dolphin ride, our destination is a short elevator ride up, where we'll find ourselves in a military town run by none other than Shinra, where they're about to have a parade for their new president, Rufus. Upon reaching the entrance of Upper Junon, the party becomes adamant about wanting to talk to Rufus. The conflict between Shinra and our party is a bit confusing and we want to sort things out. So Cloud comes up with the grand idea of posing as soldiers. This way we can join in on the parade and possibly get close enough to talk to him. In the midst of stealing some uniforms for this plan, we get caught by a commander. He asks us why we skipped practice and tells us to show him we're prepared. In doing so, Cloud's rifle skills are impressive enough to instantly promote him to lead the 7th Midgar Infantry. And so our task is now to gather up all the troops that are goofing around town and then lead them in the parade. This might be my favorite section of the game. Not only because it's so silly and ridiculous, but running around and exploring here is absolutely fun and rewarding to do. One of the very first things I did was walk up to a standing cutout of Rufus. Some of the troops that we're looking for are standing right next to him trying to take a picture. So before they head out to get ready for the parade, they ask us to take a photo for them. But it's possible to snap a pic of something else completely, which is exactly what I did. And then there was actually some dialogue for messing up the photo and it made my heart happy. When the game actually responds to my stupid ideas like this, it always makes me grin. For the rest of this mission, or quest, we're told there's 10 total groups of troops to find, but only 5 are required. Although I wanted to find all 10 just because I was having so much fun running around town. I kinda get why the soldiers are out and about now. On top of that, the more troops you recruit, the more this huge squadron following Cloud around starts to become, and who doesn't want that? Plus, finding every troop nearly guarantees that you'll see all of Junon, which is something you'll definitely want to do. After gathering enough troops, it's time to create a lineup for the parade. One important thing I didn't realize during my first playthrough is that this marching minigame has a difficulty setting, and it's based on which troops you choose. This is important because a higher difficulty will make it easier to earn points and win the parade award. For example, if your lineup is a setup of the same 5 units, this will be indicated by an arrow chaining them together. Counterintuitively, this puts the parade on easy mode, but there isn't a reason to do easy mode. I'm not even sure it's possible to win the competition by playing on anything but the highest difficulty, where a lineup can only have one connection at max. It was pretty confusing as to what I was even trying to do when making my formation for the first time, and the little tutorial box that usually pops up on the side for these kinds of activities was missing, because instead they give you this tutorial before you start even recruiting soldiers for some reason, which is a horrible place to put it, and they should have at least given it to players a second time before they select their formation, because I was just hard staring at my connections in the middle like a dummy and trying to figure out what in the world the formation bonuses even did. Eventually I decided I should just move on with my life, and I chose whatever the highest formation bonus was. Again, I think this is what makes this confusing because that's not what I wanted at all. In fact, a lower formation bonus leads to a higher difficulty where it becomes easier to score more points and actually win the parade competition. The system just felt overly convoluted to understand with little to no guidance. I just think it could have been more clearly shown that certain formations led to different parade choreographies that have a higher difficulty. But at the end of the day, it's really not that important. Winning this section just gives players an achievement and a little trophy for later. It's not anything special. It seems like it's only for achievement hunters or people who like to find little Easter eggs, and anyone interested will likely just find out by looking it up on Google. Still, I found it strange. For nearly every other minigame, the goal and rules are either fairly obvious or a little tutorial will pop up to explain what's going on. And while the minigames were easily one of my favorite parts of Rebirth, the parade might have been one of the lowest on that list. But not even because it's confusing, but it's also not very fun. I never enjoyed this weird pseudo-rhythm game situation that just feels like glorified QuickTime events. I'd much rather just be playing a more straightforward rhythm game. But besides the parade and a similar game later on, I love just about every single one of these minigames. They almost always felt like a nicely needed detour from whatever else was going on. But the minigame I loved most of all was Queen's Blood, though calling it a minigame feels wrong when it could be its entirely own separate game. I had so much fun with it right away that I purposely looked for it everywhere I went. The game itself is not only fun but strategically deep with many viable playstyles, and I found that most of them can consistently win if played well. Some strategies involve having a control-like deck where the main goal is debuffing or destroying enemy cards, and then having cards that combo with those to empower them, making them worth more points. It was satisfying to slowly understand the game more and more and realize the best moves for the situation. Beyond the card game itself, the fact that there are multiple quest lines tied to this game tells me how badly they wanted to showcase this. Not to mention, defeating more and more opponents unlocks a separate side story all by itself. Yu-Gi-Oh! Might as well be real in the Rebirth universe. Back to the story, after a successful march in the parade, you'll at the very least win the President's Award and get to meet face to face with Rufus. He wants to make a deal. We leave Midgar alone and he forgets we exist as long as we deal with Sephiroth. Except this trade seems to be terminated when our little ninja friend Yuffie tries to assassinate him and the whole of Upper Junon is now on high alert looking for suspects. This next section becomes a solo Cloud mission where we are escorted by some loyal troopers of the Midgar infantry. They'll support with cover fire as Cloud fights his way through. Eventually we run into an old friend who wants to duel us once again. After winning, we leave our troops behind and head towards the rest of our party bound for a getaway cruise.
My friend.
The reason we decided to get on this cruise is that we see a bunch of the Black Robe men we've been tracking boarding a ship, so without any other leads on Sephiroth, we don't have much of a choice but to follow them. Luckily, these robe dudes have some good taste considering this cruise features a Queen's Blood tournament. Here you'll see a ton of familiar faces while running around and facing opponents, and some new ones too. It seems our entire crew wants to join in as well, except for Red 13 because he gets denied entry and justifiably goes into Karen mode over it. My first time playing in the tournament was a bit rough, but thankfully the game lets you retry as many matches as you'd like, and I desperately needed to retry. After eventually winning, a surprise contender shows up for one final show match. It's a good callback to the original, and is also just a fun gag. After our bout against the pup, Sephiroth finally makes another appearance. Well, sort of. A bunch of men in black robes morph together while screaming reunion, and Sephiroth appears afterwards. But then a slimy tentacle demon, or a Genova emergent, spawns in. After slashing down this strange monstrosity, this ship carries on like normal. Sure, okay, but what the heck just happened? Was Sephiroth actually here, or is Cloud just imagining him? Why does this Genova thing appear? Isn't that just Sephiroth's mom or something? First of all, everything to do with Sephiroth in Final Fantasy VII is pretty confusing, on purpose. And when it comes to the remake and Rebirth, they decide to push this chaos to even further extremes. Here's what we do know. In the original game, while on the boat, Sephiroth seems to come out of nowhere. He has a cryptic message that simply is, "The time is now." At this point in the original, we can be certain that our party also saw Sephiroth, not only because they get knocked over from his flyby, but they also repeat his cryptic message of "the time is now," asking what in the world he meant by that. Meanwhile, in Rebirth, this section plays out a bit differently. For one, we no longer receive any kind of acknowledgement from our team that Sephiroth was just here. Cloud seems to be the only one that can see him, as usual. And I imagine if someone else could see him or hear him, we would expect them to say something about it. Especially Tifa, because in Rebirth, Sephiroth says, "Don't let her fool you," alluding to the whole Tifa isn't real thing. To be blunt, I don't like this change very much. I get they're trying to push this whole puppet master thing going on between Sephiroth and Cloud, but it feels kind of out of place here. Like to keep bringing up this Tifa isn't real bit, but I don't think it's that interesting. And I especially don't like how it portrays Tifa, where she seems to just blindly believe in Cloud and trust him despite him not really being able to do the same for her. It sort of makes me think they're both kind of delusional, which is maybe the point, I'm not sure. Cloud is the only tangible thing she has left to hold on to from her village and childhood, so it also kind of shows how desperate she is to not let him slip through her hands despite everything about it being kind of messed up. I like this part of it. I think it shows the depth of Tifa's character earlier on. I just think they probably could have found a better way to show this side of her that didn't seem so insane. I will say an aspect I do like about the whole puppet master thing is how well it lines up Cloud's hunches about going towards the direction of Sephiroth. In the original, it feels like we're only following the thinnest paper trail of all time trying to track him down, and we just kind of happen to end up finding him from time to time. This is later explained by the fact that Cloud has been juiced up with Genova cells like the rest of the rogue men, so he's just following him all along in the same exact way the rest of them were. Even if in Rebirth it's a bit excessive in terms of just how often we see the rogue men, it's something that I think plays out a little better. I like that Cloud is like its soldier's intuition, but it's basically just a little compass in his head that points directly towards Sephiroth. But because we simply end up following the rogue men, it sort of gives Cloud this deniability that he isn't exactly like them. And because we have this, we don't necessarily need the rest of the party to be convinced that we're on the right track for finding Sephiroth by seeing him. That soldier's intuition has yet to steer them in the wrong direction. In the original, Sephiroth being visible to the rest of the party was more important to simply show that they were on the right path that wasn't based on the idea Cloud is probably right. So ultimately, what I don't like are what these little private conversations between Cloud and Sephiroth end up as. I don't understand exactly why Sephiroth wants Cloud to believe Tifa isn't real. Is it simply just to make him lose trust in her? But why? And does it really make the story and characters better for it? So far, it feels like no, it doesn't. Because another part of this that bugs me is that Tifa and the rest of the party continue to put so much faith into Cloud incident after incident. This guy has schizophrenic episodes where he believes Tifa isn't real or is some kind of spy out to get him, and because of that, Cloud actively tries to harm her during one of them. Tifa aside, why does the rest of the party trust being around someone like that? Maybe they can see that Tifa just loves Cloud that much, or even that he's being controlled, but I'm not sure. It's hard to tell because the party isn't very explicit on what they think about Cloud's little episodes. They seem to notice that they happen, but don't say much beyond that. What I can be sure of is that Sephiroth is even more confusing and strange in Remake than he is in the original. And this confusion is taken to even further extremes by the addition of different timelines in Rebirth. I mentioned near the start that Rebirth begins with a cutscene showing us what seems to be a parallel world. To understand what's going on, the only thing you need to know is that this guy is Zack Fair. Like Cloud, he's a first-class soldier and became friends with him during their time together in the military. You wouldn't know this unless you played the original first, but back in our world, Zack is dead, yet for some reason we see him alive. Even stranger, it seems that Barrett, Tifa, and Red 13 died on their mission to save Aerith while escaping Midgar. And for whatever reason, it seems that Cloud wasn't involved. Without him, their mission failed. Guess Cloud's motorcycle fighting skills were more important than I previously thought. Although Aerith ends up surviving. Kind of. Both her and Cloud seem to be in a coma-like state. The first cutscene reveals all of this to us, as well as Zack rescuing Aerith from being taken from Shiner once again and finding a safe place for them to recover. Whether or not you've played the original game, this is an incredibly confusing scenario. In fact, it's maybe even more so if you've played the original game and understand who Zack is. You'll have so many more questions beside who is that, instead you're left to wonder why in the world is he alive and how is he here. I suppose I don't totally understand the reasoning behind having a parallel world, and I'm left wondering what kind of value it will have, if any, because I really feel that the story is much better without including this situation. In a lot of ways, it feels like it was added as a way to keep fans of the original guessing and wondering if the events are going to stay the same or not, and then keep it the same anyways because that's mostly what's happened so far. But I don't think they needed any kind of justification to keep fans guessing. Fans of Final Fantasy VII loved the game mainly for the story, characters, and the world it presents. I think Square could have kept the story nearly identical and people would have liked it even more. And I definitely don't think newcomers needed the additional confusion on top of 7's already fairly wacky story. This is why I don't like the parallel world situation. It doesn't seem to add any value to the overall story and gameplay that's worth the confusion. I think the only thing we get out of it that's interesting is the extra perspective of Zack, but there's gotta be a better way of doing this, like simply going into the past or being in a dream. I feel that including a parallel universe and the like is not at all worth the effort. I think the worst part of all of this is that it feels like a bogus excuse, like the reason they're allowed to make changes to Remake and Rebirth is because there are now infinite versions of this world, and we're just experiencing this one. Although I can see how they're building this into Sephiroth having some sort of master plan that traverses all the parallel worlds, but it's still pretty lame, and it probably won't work anyways. And on top of that, it just brings way too many confusing questions into play. Like, if Cloud can suddenly hop between different parallel worlds, what's to stop him from finding one where Aerith is alive and asking her to help us stop Sephiroth here? In fact, maybe that's already what's happened. How do we know Tifa isn't actually a fake Tifa from another parallel universe that Sephiroth has brought here and he's been telling the truth this entire time? I don't like thinking about silly quandaries like these, but when a story introduces something as far-fetched and complex as these parallel worlds where people can magically float between them, retain memories from them, and then even move objects between them, silly questions tend to arise. I mean, why don't we just open a giant freaking hole that Sephiroth's meteor can fit into and send it into a universe where our world is already dead? In fact, isn't this kind of what the ending of Remake looks like? Sephiroth spawns the meteor, and then it gets sucked up into some kind of void. But part of the destruction it has caused to Midgar seems to remain. Is my stupid idea actually kind of what's happening? I really hope not. Another part of this ridiculous problem is that one of Sephiroth's goals of the reunion seems to be to merge these parallel worlds. However the heck that works. Are the differences between them taken out or added in somehow? What does it even really mean to merge a parallel world? I have no idea, and I'm not sure I want to know. I would honestly just be fine with them scrapping the idea entirely and closing off the connections between them somehow, making them irrelevant. Then their sole purpose was just a way to include Zack. A lot of this just feels convoluted for the sake of it, like the mumbo jumbo that is Kingdom Hearts. And if I had to guess why it was included, it's probably for the same reason anything exists the way it does in Final Fantasy VII, because Square thought it was cool. But unfortunately, parallel worlds are not as universally cool as a guy with a big sword, which is why I believe the actual reason that Final Fantasy VII is great is not the rule of cool, but the rule of fun. Snowboarding down a mountain is fun, but parallel worlds, not so much. Now, despite saying all that, and I do hate to admit it, but there are parts of the parallel world that I think are well done. I especially like this little moment where there's a transition between worlds, where Zack is holding Aerith's hand and she is touching the lifestream water back in our reality. And then suddenly she snaps back as if she felt something, alluding to the idea that the lifestream or Mako can somehow connect these worlds, and I wouldn't be surprised to see this come back in an important way. There's also another sequence where the parallel worlds work pretty nicely near the end of the game, where Cloud and Aerith go on a date while the world might collapse at any moment. I think it plays out the idea pretty well, namely because it's an interaction that feels a little more real than something like a dream. It actually happened to both Cloud and Aerith, and something physical is brought from that world because of it. Also, something notable during this date sequence is that the game offers the player a lot of choices. Cloud is tasked with deciding things such as what to gift Aerith, but no matter what is chosen, the result is the same every time. Each person we talk to will decide on the gift for Aerith instead of whatever option we chose. The photographer will never take our photo no matter which pose is selected. We can never choose the chocolate candy, and in the same vein, no matter what decisions Cloud makes, Aerith is always fated to die to Sephiroth. We can also see this reflected in Zack's story. We see him a bit before the date where he's stuck between deciding to save Cloud or Biggs. Either choice leads him to being hunted down by Shinra soldiers in the same way he was fated to die before the parallel worlds came into play. It would be difficult to not notice that the writers at Square Enix have an absolute obsession over the idea of fate. Whether it's Final Fantasy VII, 1013, or pretty much any Dragon Quest game. Although it's less of a Final Fantasy thing and more of a trope of stories in general, still the theme of fate, a chosen hero, anti-hero, or some other variation tends to be pretty heavily present within JRPGs. Except Final Fantasy tends to lean more towards either looking to deny fate or find ways to accept it rather than following some kind of foretold prophecy. So I think Square is trying to make a point that Cloud desperately wants to save Aerith, but there isn't even a parallel universe that exists where it's possible. In relation to this, it's hinted to us that Aerith and Red already knew this to be a predetermined outcome of their future, with the caveat of they forgot. They both mentioned that they were at one point aware of what was to come, but after leaving Midgard, their memories of future events were erased. Probably something to do with Aerith's white materia wholly and how it shifted from pure white to being transparent. I remember thinking it's strange they included a detail about Aerith and Red being able to tell the future and then forgetting everything they learned, because like what's the point of that? But later on, Red reveals some critical information he suddenly remembers to Cloud. He has a faint memory that something dire will happen to Aerith, and that Cloud should try to prevent it by always keeping her close. And if the white materia does have some sort of role in this ability, it might make sense for it to come back into play in the next game if we're able to retrieve it from the ancient city later. If I had to guess, back in Midgard, Aerith could already see the future when her and Cloud met for the first time. This is the same moment where the Whispers are introduced, which is probably because she tried to act on her knowledge, that is, change fate. And seemingly this is the main difference between the remake and the original. There's a few people who know what the future holds: Sephiroth, Aerith, and to some extent, Red 13. Aerith losing her ability to see the future would also help explain why the Whispers don't really show up as much during Rebirth. With no way to disrupt whatever fate might be in store for them, there's simply no reason to interfere. Except when a change happens in Gongaga, but this time it's by Sephiroth, where he again manipulates Cloud into thinking that Tifa isn't real, causing Cloud to take a swing at her. She dodges but falls into a pool of Mako and is eaten by a giant fish and taken for a ride through the live stream. Here we'll see that there are more Whispers involved than just the shadowy ones we've witnessed before. There are a bunch of whitish or pinkish colored Whispers flying around. I'm not sure, I'm kind of colorblind. The point is that there are two different Whispers and they seem to be in conflict with each other. From what we learned here, it seems that the Dark Whispers work for Sephiroth while the Light work for Aerith or maybe the planet in general. After Gongaga, it's a while before we see these Whispers again, but they finally reappear in the final chapter of Rebirth, right after Cloud has his parallel universe date with Aerith. I suspect this is because Aerith has given Cloud her holy materia from that world, and then he in turn has passed it back to Aerith in this world, possibly giving her the ability to see the future and alter fate again. While this is all sort of interesting to think about, it's more confusing than illuminating. Also, I would keep in mind that a lot of my ideas here have been mostly speculation, so I would advise against taking my Whisper theories too seriously, as I feel like I have no idea what's going on. But what I do know is that Square wants a reason for people who already know the story to have questions in mind for what's happening. More specifically, I think they want players to continue asking the question of, can fate of the original game be changed? And I think they've succeeded in that because it's still tough to say at this point. Although I'm certainly leaning towards, yes, fate can be changed, especially considering how different things have turned out from the original at the end of Rebirth. Although that's also what I thought about the end of the first game, so who knows what'll happen. I will say I'm a bit torn on whether or not I like what's going on, but the reality is that I'll have no way to know for sure until I've finished part 3.
There's no point in wasting our time worrying about fate if we can't change it.
That was a fun detour, but let's start to get back on track. These past few sections have been filled to the brim with minigames, but I do think this is a big part of what makes the gameplay of Rebirth so fun for me. That said, I have heard the complaints that the amount of minigames is a bit excessive, so it's hard to disagree because there are a lot of minigames, and if you're not enjoying them, I can see how they would seem intrusive. But I would always contend with the idea of removing them from Rebirth or even making them completely optional. I think they make it a far better game and help the pacing tremendously, most of the time. I also think they help balance the serious tone we get in the story with how wacky the people and its world is. Speaking of wacky, our short cruise eventually lands us in the resort town Costa del Sol, which happens directly after taking care of the Junova and Sephiroth appearance on the ship. And after this strange encounter, the group decides a day of relaxation is needed. Which really means running around and playing copious amounts of minigames in order to purchase the fabulous swimwear that is required for going to the beach. The goal of this section is to get one outfit for each of Tifa, Cloud, and Aerith, and just like in Upper Junon, there is a minimum requirement of things to do instead of being forced to do it all. It's a win-win, giving double the minigames for me, and 2 outfits for each of these characters to obtain, and it doesn't feel like as much of a slog for these minigame haters. I think, again, that the availability and how much you want to do is great, and I couldn't wait to do all of it. Anyways, after crushing some high scores, we eventually move on to the beach and encounter Hojo, the weird kidnapper mad scientist guy everyone hates. There was a short cutscene of him earlier during Sephiroth's disruption on the cruise, where we see him foaming at the mouth watching these black robe men combine with invading Junova creatures. So he came to Costa himself to take a few hostages for his own experiments. Of course, we don't want to let him do whatever he wants, and we especially hate that he's terrorizing our otherwise relaxing beach time. While I do like this section now, something felt really off about it my first time through. It felt a bit sudden and out of nowhere. It was probably because I spent so much time zooming around Costa on my Segway without a care in the world. and I probably just kind of forgot what in the world was happening in the plot while chasing the dopamine highs of minigame supremacy. But on my second playthrough, I ended up skipping the entire minigame section. I had to hold myself back, but because I did, I noticed the story continued with a little bit of a better flow. So even though I absolutely love the minigames and the other junk there is to do in Costa, the minigame haters might win this one, I think. The pacing might just be a little off here because by the time Hojo shows up, players like me may have no idea why in the world he would be here at all, or even remember that the boat cutscene happened. Although hinting to the player that Hojo was on his way by maybe showing a little scene of him lurking around might have been helpful. I can't blame it all on the minigames. My lack of attention for the plot also could have just been my general disgust for Hojo and having to deal with him at all. But for my second playthrough, because this situation ends up leading to one of my favorite side quests in the game, I've become a little more forgiving and kept my eyes glued. Which mostly means embracing the ridiculousness that seems to be a must to enjoy Rebirth. Here's what happens on the beach. We see Johnny, a friend from Midgar we meet in Remake. He ends up being ordered around by Hojo, but obviously he isn't very happy about it. He's only following orders because he's been told to do so by some bigwig that he owes a ton of money. Johnny is the kind of guy who gets into a lot of trouble. Anyways, Hojo suddenly releases some of the Genova creatures we saw on the boat, and they start combining with the robed men. He then also sends out some robots to hold these monsters captive, which are also capturing our crew who is getting in his way. During this, Yuffie once again appears as she has in the past several sections. She's a ninja from a different nation and wants to join Avalanche. In order to keep Hojo's claw-grabbing machines busy, she somehow makes like 8 clones of Johnny in order to distract them. In fact, this section sort of feels like it only exists to support this ridiculous side quest of helping Johnny out later, which I am totally okay with. After Yuffie creates these clones and we go our merry way, it turns out they never went away. Instead, the original Johnny has sent these clones out on a mission to help him repair his broken down seaside resort. I'm just in love with the idea that for some reason Johnny has 8 clones and still can't get anything done. So we have to go find every single one of these extra Johnnies running around outside of Coral to look for parts and fix his resort. Not to mention the fact that 1 Johnny was already a handful, 8 is unmanageable. Truthfully, most of these quest objectives aren't anything special. It's mostly about finding the clones and doing their little fetch quest. Although the last section where we get to fight a giant tonberry is pretty fun. But besides that, it's mostly just running around and picking up items that have been left on the ground. But because the premise alone was so funny and stupid, I found that it made even the most mundane tasks seem kind of fun. I think the expansions of Seven's World, like this one, fit pretty well into the silly mold that has been Rebirth. Again, it's not because it's cool, it's because it's fun. It's a weird mashup of different games and activities that somehow make sense within that world. Well, as much sense as parallel world hopping anyways. But it does all fit really well into just being a surreal feeling video game out of the 90s. One minute we're riding a dolphin for the sole purpose of jumping over an electric fence, and in the next we're marching in a parade for the highest government official in the world. And eventually a teenage ninja named Yuffie joins the crew after saving us from a mad scientist. It's all random nonsense, but it's pretty fun, and that's the point. But sometimes the nonsensical does have a reason behind it, or at least was eventually given a reason. Like a big man with a gun for an arm doesn't seem to make much sense. But as it turns out, Barrett does actually have a story behind his cannons, and I'm not talking about his biceps. We still do not understand how he got so large, but we do get to meet the doctor who not only saved Barrett from bleeding out after losing a limb, but also Tifa after she was slashed by Sephiroth at the Nebo reactor. Okay, but how do we know whether or not this doctor is even real? Maybe he's making up Tifa's story and he's also fake. And then Barrett must be a fake too. I mean, Chadley is a robot, so maybe everyone is really just a cyborg under Sephiroth's control. Insane conspiracy theories aside, we learn here that the people of this town loathe Barrett. The reason being, in the eyes of its citizens, he's why the town is in shambles. He was a large advocate for Coral to ally with Shinra and build a reactor here, thinking it would help Coral prosper and maybe get more people out of the mines. But not long after this reactor was built, it exploded, and soon after that, Shinra stops by to remove survivors so no one would place the blame on the company. During this massacre, Barrett is trying to help others escape. He comes across his friend Dine slipping off a cliff. He tries to pull him up, but Shinra soldiers shoot at their arms and they both lose a limb, and Dine seemingly falls to his death. It's a pretty dark and tragic story. But this is no time to be sad, as we're heading to the greatest place on the planet, the Golden Saucer. Just a short zipline trolley away, once we arrive, a Disney-like sequence of song and dance introduces us to the extreme extravagance of this theme park. During all this, a large man called Dio makes a big entrance. Turns out he's the guy who runs the theme park, and he challenges Cloud to an arcade-style duel. I will say, I don't know what happens if Cloud loses, because I would never be defeated in Rock'em Sock'em Robots. So after winning, the crowd erupts over Dio's defeat, and not even Cloud is immune to the urge to bask in his victory. As a prize, Dio gives us a free ticket to run around and do whatever we want in the theme park, so the crew runs off to explore, except for Cloud and Barrett, who grab a hotel room so Cloud can take a nap. This whole sequence of getting into the gold saucer reminds me of a similar dance-off that takes place in Midgar during Remake. The one where we go into the Honeybee Inn and talk to Andrea in order to get access to Don Corneo's Creep Castle. And it's only fitting that Andrea has somehow made an appearance in this dance-off. In fact, all the bigwigs of Wall Market keep popping up all throughout Rebirth. It's kind of fun to see them reused, but it does get a bit tiresome to see them everywhere. I like that they kept them around because their characters are pretty fun, but catching sight of them over and over again just makes me wonder how in the world are they here and at the same time as us. I feel like we're being followed or something. Maybe it's just another Sephiroth hallucination, who knows. What's not an illusion is how much I like Cait Sith in Rebirth. Not only do I love how absolutely far-fetched and silly his character is, but also his Scottish accent.
The stars work in mysterious ways.
Not really though, it was actually incredibly jarring at first, because I did my entire first playthrough with the Japanese voiceover and was a bit stunned when I heard him for the first time in English. I felt kind of dumb for not picking up the Scottish accent while reading the subtitles. Either way, I can't say I love it. I don't think the voice actor does a bad job. He sounds good, it just feels like a strange choice to me.
My apologies, sir.
It just doesn't feel like it fits his character very well, and I'm pretty certain that the Shinra employee controlling Cait Sith isn't Scottish himself. All that said, I did look up what the heck a Cait Sith is after I got an Esper in Final Fantasy VI, which helped me come to understand that his name actually comes from Celtic mythology, and the name itself is a Scottish pronunciation of this myth that means fairy cat. So while there may be no story reason for the voice, at least there is some kind of background reasoning. All in all, it's not that big of a deal. I'm not sure it really hurts Cait Sith as a character, but even with the mythology background in mind, the voice feels a little out of place. Especially considering I don't think we hear any other Scottish accented people all throughout Rebirth. Maybe they wanted him to sound like a mythical being, as if Scottish accents somehow come across that way in the world of Final Fantasy VII. Or maybe it's the opposite, and the Ice Town will be full of Scottish people, and Cait Sith will have an entire questline that involves building a high-tech snowboard or something. I don't know, I'm just making stuff up. Back at the hotel, Cait Sith helps us book a room and then gives us a few grim fortunes. Cloud and Barret don't think much of them, but are actually pretty spot on for what happens in the original. After a short nap in our spooky little room with a menacing Tonberry housekeeper/humidifier, someone will knock on the door. It will be whichever girl you have the best relationship with up to this point. Each party member has a friendship status that's based on a few factors, like how many side quests you've completed that involve them, the way in which you've answered their special prompts, and how many synergy combat moves you've performed with them. All of these add up to a value that determines how close you are to that party member, and whoever is the highest will show up at the time of each Golden Saucer date, which there are 2 of. One in our current chapter, which is number 8, as well as chapter 12. While the original did contain a relationship point system, it was definitely a lot more subtle and not as highlighted as it is here in Rebirth. I like these little intimate scenes with each party member and Cloud a lot. It gives valuable insight on how each character is feeling and what they're thinking about. Back in the hotel room for my first playthrough, Aerith showed up at the door and we went on a little tour of the Golden Saucer together, which mostly involved her following me around while I played copious amounts of minigames and bought silly prizes. My favorite minigame here is that very same Sock'em Bop'em Robots that we bested Dio in, which was also in the original, but Rebirth does a great job of giving it a makeover. It's easy to mistake this game for being simple, but it's a bit tougher than it looks. I found it pretty fun to learn the tells for each fighter and input the correct dodge when necessary. My least favorite is probably the motorcycle chaser game. I've hated pretty much every iteration of this. It's a cool idea, but in practice I don't find it very enjoyable. I don't feel as if there's enough interaction. I get that they were trying to keep it pretty similar to what the original was, but I think they could have taken a few more liberties here to give the player more control or little goals to go for. Most of the time I feel like I'm just moving left or right and then swinging endlessly at the enemy motorcycles. It's a bit too mind-numbing for me. And yeah, this is coming from the guy who likes to run around and knock over chairs. After my fill of minigames, we eventually take our date to the giant VR Ferris wheel, but suddenly there's news of a disturbance within the park. Cait Sith comes to inform us of the situation as the ride shuts down and we leave to investigate what's going on. Apparently a man with a gun for an arm went around and murdered some innocent Shinra soldiers in broad daylight. Terrified that Barret will become a prime suspect, we try to find him. Instead, we only run into Dio, and he believes the culprit is most likely to be Barret based on the report. But before condemning him right away, Dio lets us investigate to prove his innocence. He tells us that the criminal has escaped towards the prison below the Golden Saucer. The crew decides to venture out to this place beneath the park and discover what the truth is. Down in this prison, we are greeted by some crazy deplorables that knock us out and take us prisoner. Yes, we are now in a prison within a prisonception. The gang running this hellhole suitably resembles the lovely Don Corneo from Wall Market. But luckily, the gang's leader is already acquainted with who we're looking for as he's locked him up somewhere else. He strikes a deal with us. He'll free our friends and take us to the man we're looking for as long as we compete in the chocobo race and win. With no other options, we agree to these terms. We are let out from the prison cell just outside and run into the young chocobo rancher we met outside of Calm. I forgot his name, but more importantly, he brought Pico with him, the same chocobo we wrangled in the grasslands to cross the swamp. We can use him for the race, but first we need to run around the prison and do some oddball tasks in order to get bird food so Pico is healthy enough to race. It reminds me of doing some of the side quests in the remake in Sector 7, except with less cats. This is certainly another one of the weaker parts of Rebirth, especially considering I can hardly recall much I enjoyed about it. But I also don't recall really hating anything about it. It seems like Square was just trying to put a little more space between the events of the Coral Prison and going back up to the Golden Saucer so we aren't getting some kind of prison whiplash. Which I think makes sense, but I think they probably could have cut down on the tasks players need to complete here by about half. They do this exact kind of thing a few times earlier in the game, but not here for some reason. Although I think there is maybe 1 or 2 extra chores available that reward some gil that you don't have to do. Honestly, these tasks aren't that bad, but I do think they're a little too boring to take up this much time. These tasks themselves range from doing some minigames, a combat or two, and running around and verifying if what a group of people are saying is true. I feel like this kind of thing would make more sense in an area we would be spending a lot more time in to get better acquainted with it. But this isn't that place. In fact, it's the opposite. It's somewhere you want to be as far away from as possible. All in all, this section isn't horrible, but it doesn't make much sense to me. It could have easily been cut down by a fourth and still served its purpose. In other words, it overstays its welcome. Anyways, once we do gather enough nourishment for our big bird, it's off to the races. Here we'll be facing off against Chocobo Sam's chicken. His racer is the best in the biz, and defeating him is talked about as if it should be impossible. But we're Cloud Strife, soldier first class. And our acolytes up to this point range from becoming the best girl, winning the Squatting Giga Chad competition, winning the Costa del Sol Cruise Queen's Blood Tournament, and becoming a professional dolphin trainer. At this point, I wouldn't be surprised if Cloud could even sub in for a professional pianist playing a concerto for an orchestra or something. That's all to say, winning a chocobo race is just another drop in the bucket for Cloud. Surprisingly, I found the races to be a ton of fun. There's even different sets of clothes that will give birds a different set of stats and abilities like Mario Kart 8. And of course, these chocobos can drift. As someone who has played way too much Mario Kart, this was like walking from point A to point B. It's almost embarrassing to admit that, without much effort, I came in first in every race on my first try. Of course, the final races did get a bit tougher, and there was one close call where I nearly came in second, but despite it being pretty easy, I found it really enjoyable still, but maybe that's just because I'm a big Mario Kart fan. Anyways, as we cross the finish line in first, a cutscene shows our crew and captors wildly celebrating the victory. Cloud Strife really is him. Now if only Cloud could figure out who him is. Next we go back into the Coral Prison to gather everyone and hopefully find Barrett and learn that he isn't the culprit. Even though, yeah, we're already fugitives and have taken down countless Shinra soldiers at this point, so even if he did do it, I don't know why this time would put us into some kind of trouble we couldn't escape. Besides the whole being a terrorist in a theme park thing and probably not being under any threat. Yeah, I guess it's a little different. Back in the prison section, a bird leads us to where the fugitive is being kept, and luckily we run into Barrett along the way. Barrett is pretty sure he knows who the culprit is. His best friend from Coral, who he thought was long dead, and his adopted daughter's father by blood. Barrett then pleads with the party to let him confront Dyne alone to try and steer him in the right direction. This is a really heartfelt scene that is one of the perfect reasons for the remake to exist. Even realizing his friend is probably too far gone, Barrett is desperate for Dyne to regain his sanity and do the right thing. He even tries to show him that Marlene is still alive and deserves to have her real dad around. But it's too late for him, and despite Barrett's best attempts, there's nothing he can do for this man who has long lost his will to continue living. Dyne, seeing that Marlene was still alive, lifted and crushed him all at once. He saw himself as a monster, and he never wanted his daughter, who wouldn't even recognize him, to see him for what he has become. This moment does a lot to show just how much Barrett cares for the people he loves, how loyal he is, and how he will put every ounce of his hulking mass towards trying to make things right. During all of this, one of Shinra's bossmen, along with the Turks, who we kind of inadvertently screwed over every step of the way at the Gold Saucer without knowing, ends up throwing an absolute fit and decides to come take it out on us. We destroy his robot, and then Dio shows up and reveals he's been listening to us the entire time. As we have proved ourselves innocent, he decides to fend off the Turks for us and give us a new whip to get away in. As we make our escape in our new buggy, a bunch of Shinra troops try to stop us, and now we're allowed to gun down the Shinra troopers as much as we want without getting into trouble. It feels weird that we are quite literally doing what we were just accused of and now being rewarded for it. But again, not in a theme park this time, and we are under threat, so it makes some sense, but it still feels a little weird. That's just video games for you, I guess. Anyways, after getting away and having the buggy in our possession, crossing the vast Coral Desert has never been easier. We can do some side quest, world exploration, and then make our way to Gongaga. But before we move into the jungle, this is as good a time as any to talk about everyone's favorite cyborg, Chadley. And when I say everyone's favorite, I really mean that robot kid everyone can't stop complaining about. I didn't really understand all the hate towards Chadley at first, but this is probably due to a few factors. First off, again, my initial playthrough was in Japanese, and it might be the case that a lot of people's annoyance of Chadley actually comes from hearing his voice. While hearing Chadley talk during my first playthrough, I didn't perceive it as annoying. But when I did some of the open world tasks with the English voiceover on, it didn't take long for me to dread finishing one of these quests just to wonder whether or not that little demon was going to show up. There's just something about the way he talks that's infuriating, but it's not only that. If doing these world quests back to back in quick succession, then he'll be dropping in all the time. It's a needless interaction after the first. And it started to remind me of how awful it was to accept quests in Final Fantasy XVI. It just feels like my time is being wasted. Even if Chadley appeared on my screen half as often, it would still be too much. If the open world activities are at all similar in the next game, I hope they desperately cut back on the amount of Chadley we see. Overall, these interactions are really annoying and makes me feel like I'm being treated like a child, especially when I'm told how something works for the 10th time. Yeah, Chadley, I get it. I've done this task 17 times now. But that's enough cyborg hate for now. Back to our buggy adventures. Once we hit the river separating the desert from the jungle, it's unfortunate, but we have to abandon our ride. As we trek our way through the cliffs and trees of this overgrown jungle, we eventually reach the village of Gongaga. There's a few guards defending the place, and they stop us to ask us why we're here. We explain our situation, and they let us through. While exploring town, at some point Cloud will notice Aerith is talking to an old couple, and she follows them inside. As Cloud is the nosiest man alive, we walk in completely uninvited to find out what's going on. We learn that Aerith noticed that this couple somewhat resembles her old soldier boy Zack, and she was wondering if they had heard from him. Unfortunately, they were hoping that she might have heard from him. It's a bit depressing and maybe even more so when you're in the know about the situation. Cloud takes another nap and wakes up to a familiar loud roar. It sounds like it's coming from the reactor, so the crew decides to leave the gals behind and the guys will go investigate. There's a nice little dungeon here where we trudge through the broken down reactor and get to the core only to find that Shinra has arrived. There's another gigafish or weapon inside the pool of Mako contained in this reactor, and within this fish is a huge materia that Shinra would like to take with them. Cloud and the gang get ready to fight, but before that happens, the game takes us back to the village. The girls have noticed that Shinra has shown up around the same time the boys make it to the reactor. They are given some of the local chocobos to ride and grappling hooks so we can speed our way there and help them out. I think this is another good expansion in Rebirth. In the original, Gongaga is pretty small and like 3 total screens of area to explore. This additional story adds a lot more depth to these jungles and surrounding area. For one, it gives a way to split the party up and in turn makes a great opportunity to reuse the same dungeon in a new way. And for this reason, I really like the design of the Gongaga reactor. Coming back with the girls armed with grappling hooks changes the dungeon up completely. The grapple hook is a fun interaction in spite of how absolutely insane it seems, especially when grappling like 2 feet away and Tifa looks like she's going to bonk her head on the rusty steel beam. Beyond that, the reactor has a bunch of good interactions that kept me interested. Whether it's plugging stuff in, sliding parts around, going down a rope, or raising the water levels to change the dungeon up once again. After the gals swing their way into the core of the reactor, it's time for another Shinra executive boss fight. Our materia-hungry ladies crush Shinra's materia-hungry lady, and we get a big cutscene of how everything unfolds afterwards. And for reasons mentioned earlier, the Whispers are here. Here is where Sephiroth again starts to change fate. Because of his meddling, Cloud starts to go a bit crazy and is no longer in control of his actions. Like Sephiroth is pulling his strings to do his bidding. Cloud very aggressively takes out some Shinra soldiers, and Tifa tries to comfort him to tell him it's going to be okay. But then Sephiroth snaps back in with his favorite line that he repeats over and over of "she isn't real." Cloud then becomes compelled to go along with his rage and starts moving aggressively towards Tifa. Despite her best efforts to prove Cloud otherwise, he takes a swing, making Tifa's only choice to dive backwards into the pool of Mako. She seems like she's going to be okay as the rest of the crew isn't too far, but then she is suddenly swallowed by one of the giant materia fish we saw earlier. And of course, right afterwards, Cloud stops freaking out and recognizes that he'd done something terrible. But it's too late, and the next thing we see is Tifa being guided through the livestream inside the belly of a beast. This brings us back to the Battle of the Whispers I had briefly mentioned earlier, where there seems to be some sort of fight for the fate of the planet going on between groups of light and dark whispers. Within this live stream sequence, we see some memories of Tifa's childhood she seems to have forgotten about after she fell in Nebo Mountain when looking for her mother. She's being shown how much Cloud actually cared about her even though they weren't that close back then. And then suddenly, Sephiroth shows up in the midst of this whisper battle and attacks the Gigafish carrying Tifa. Then at the end of this sequence, we see Cloud following in Sephiroth's footsteps and Tifa reaching out towards him. From my perspective, this seems to be less of a battle for the destiny of the planet and more so a battle for the fate of Cloud, which may in turn be who is able to decide what happens to the planet. So same, but ultimately the goal here is to help Tifa realize that the real Cloud is still in there somewhere, but he desperately needs her help to get past the whole Sephiroth trying to control him thing. She has to fight for what she wants, to save Cloud and to save the planet. This is a really cool moment that I didn't expect at all. I think it also does a great job in potentially setting up Tifa and Cloud's journey into the live stream together later on. As Tifa is now someone who is experienced with exploring this place, she can better serve as a guide to help Cloud find himself when the time comes. Tifa's existential experience finally ends and the Gigafish comes out of the Mako pool to spit her out, and we all head back to Gongaga to rest. When Tifa awakes, she tells Cloud about how she's remembered what actually happened the day she went looking for her mother who passed away. The Cloud was the only one actually there for her and the rest of her friends ran away. For this, she calls him a hero. But Cloud disagrees. What kind of hero falls off the cliff with the person they're trying to save, or is the one that pushed him off the ledge? Cloud then starts talking about the issues he's having, where he feels like he's two people living inside one body and he can't tell where he begins and the other ends. Cloud believes his cells are degrading from the soldier operation, but Tifa tries to reassure him that won't happen to him, and that it's her turn to save him. Again, this is another addition I like a lot. I think it gives a lot of reasons to cheer for Tifa and Cloud, as well as some actual insight into how both of them are feeling and handling Cloud's schizophrenic episodes. It helps it all make a little more sense, especially as to exactly why Tifa is willing to continue to put her trust into Cloud even though he almost killed her. It gives us some kind of justification for why she wants to help him escape this nightmare he's going through. After Cloud and Tifa talk things out, the party decides that they should learn more about what's going on with the planet in order to better understand how to save it. And what better way than going to Cosmo Canyon, which is where all the planet researchers live. The Gongaga village head honcho gives us a little map to a nearby airstrip where we can catch a plane to the canyon. Which introduces us to our next team member, Sid, the ex-Shinra pilot. Meeting him here is much sooner than we would in the original, which will cause a much larger departure from the script later on. But for now, he's just here to help us get from point A to B. Hopefully, we'll get to see more of his fighting prowess in the next game. We fly smoothly into Cosmo Canyon and then head towards the village. As we're about to enter, someone suddenly calls Red 13 Nanaki, and he responds with a much higher pitched voice than we're used to. It seems that he's been doing a bit of acting to appear older and more mature, mostly because he didn't think he would be respected otherwise. As we try to enter town, a guard checks our faces to see if they match a certain wanted poster before we go in, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because I'm pretty sure Cosmo Canyon has no relation to Shinra and wants nothing to do with them considering how drastically their goals differ. But a little bit before this happens, we're given a short cutscene of Kate Sith's operator changing the party's wanted poster. So it seems Square added this little interaction only to confirm to the party that Kate Sith was able to help them avoid some potential confrontations. If Square is going to keep trying to include details about how we're on the run, then I don't hate the idea of this, still it just feels weird for it to happen in this spot. Again, why would the people of Cosmo Canyon care? This also could have easily taken place in our next destination, Nibelheim. That town is run entirely by Shinra, so it would make more sense for them to be more wary of us. Even still, I don't understand why this detail of being on the run has been shoved down our throats so much. It feels really forced. Shinra hunting us never feels like an actual consequence, unless the Turks show up as they tend to do. But half the reason we're running into them is because we're looking for the same thing as them. It's not like the Turks are completely out to get us, we're just kind of in each other's way. So what I'm really trying to get at here is that why does Square feel that it's necessary to add this detail that our group is on the run from Shinra? The whole fugitive storyline just doesn't ever feel important, and it's not in the original, so why add it in? And honestly, things like Kate Sith changing the wanted posters is hard to buy. Surely if the people and guards of Cosmo Canyon have been on the lookout for wanted criminals, they would have had the old poster too. And if you consider that the village seems to get a lot of tourists, the guards probably looked at the poster every day, so they probably would have recognized us. It all just feels a bit fake and over the top. And even if everyone in Cosmo Canyon knew we were the suspected terrorists who fought against Shinra, wouldn't most of the people of Cosmo Canyon be on our side anyways? So overall, I don't understand this added fugitive storyline. Sure, yes, it makes some sense considering our crew is in fact a bunch of terrorists, but whether the people of differing towns know that or not doesn't matter. It wouldn't change the dynamics of the overall plot or story, and it never feels like we're fugitives. Criminal allegations aside, let's get back to Cosmo Canyon, where our little terror group splits off for a bit. Tifa, Cloud, and Aerith go with Nanaki to meet a planetary scientist called Bugenhagen. He's a head researcher at the observatory as well as Nanaki's teacher. All of a sudden, we hear a familiar roar that Bugenhagen describes as the planet crying out, but Tifa says that's not the planet, but actually a protector of the planet known as a weapon, or that giant fish thing she was in. The professor brushes off Tifa's explanation with, "You're hallucinating and must be poisoned by the Mako." He then shows us his little planetarium that has a model of the solar system we're in. He talks about the live stream and the fate of the planet if it dries out. Tifa asks how he doesn't know using Mako as energy doesn't just return to the live stream somehow, but in a different form. The professor again rejects her ideas and sends her to a lecture to be further re-educated. We then go to find Aerith and Tifa at the lecture, where Tifa is trying her best to bumble her way through what she believes she saw while in the livestream. She seems embarrassed to be talking about it and gives up on trying to explain what she's feeling. Then the final part of this section is the Festival of Lights the canyon is having tonight. Everyone meets up at the bonfire and we get a nice little intimate conversation with each of our teammates about how they're feeling about everything. And lastly, for some reason, Aerith is giving a speech to everyone before we send the lanterns off. I suppose it's because she's a Cetra and someone asked her to speak, but I don't know. This is kind of awkward but cute at the same time, especially when Cloud gives her a little encouragement during the speech. I kind of like it, but it also makes me want to puke. I'm pretty conflicted. I also just still have seriously no clue why she's giving a speech all of a sudden to these random strangers. I feel like it would have made more sense if she was just talking to our party. Overall, I find the Cosmo Canyon section to be just okay. I think if it was a little more self-guided exploration instead of Bugenhagen leading you all around the place, it might have felt a little bit better. But there's also no minigames in town, what's up with that? And the Chocobo flying minigame outside of town was held to 100%. Something I do like about the Cosmo Canyon section is where we get to hear about the crew talk about their feelings on the current situation. But still, something about it seems off. But maybe it's just because much of the party doesn't really know how to get what they're feeling across well. So maybe it feels awkward because that's exactly what they were going for.
Pretty sappy, huh?
The crew eventually settles down and sets their lanterns free. Then Bugenhagen finds us saying there's something important he needs to show Nanaki, so we follow him into a cave that's been locked behind a big vault door. The professor tells Red that he is to undertake a trial in order to become a protector of the Veil, which is his life goal. And if he is to complete this trial, he wants to stay in Cosmo Canyon to fulfill his duty. Once we get past this vault door, we're told that he must take an observer with him. Cloud volunteers, but Bugenhagen rejects him and says Barrett should tag along instead. After completing the trials and reaching the end of the cave, we find Red's father trapped in a stone form. He had grown up with a fake story that his father was a coward who ran from the village when the Gi attacked. But it was all a lie to keep him away from the dangers this guarded vault held until now. So Red 13 finds new resolve in his purpose and decides to continue pursuing Sephiroth with the group instead of staying in the Veil. Soon following this heartfelt moment, a Gi spirit shows up requesting that we hear his plea for help. We follow him on a boat across a lake of Mako. He talks about the intolerance of the Cetra and how they made his people eternal prisoners. Aerith gets a little offended saying, what about her? He mentions that while she is certainly a Cetra, it is of blood only. Eventually, we finally dock our boat at the village of Gi. And even though we are supposedly guests here, the villagers don't seem to care and attack us repeatedly. Not a very welcoming place. And we soon learn that the Gi are sort of immortal, and they'd rather not be. Their spirits cannot die and return to the lifestream because they are not from the lifestream. We're told the only thing they actually want is to be unbound from this planet and to return to nothingness. And the only way this can happen is if we bring them the Black Materia. None of the crew really knows what the Black Materia is yet, but Cloud gets a vision of Sephiroth, and then Cloud says we should not give it to the Gi under any circumstance. So it seems like that's probably him saying that out of Sephiroth's desire, but as usual, it's hard to tell. But Cloud is willing to play along with the idea that we might give it to them for now. The Gi spirit who led us here then tells us we should be able to find the Black Materia at a site of Cetra worship. To which Kate Sith suggests there's an ancient Cetra temple that might be the place he's talking about, but he'll need access to a Shinra terminal to get more info on it. So eventually we leave the cave and end up back at the entrance of the canyon, where we find a black-robed man muttering Nibelheim, which gives Kate Sith the idea that's where we should go next because there should be a Shinra terminal there we can use in the town. So next we'll need another plane ride from Sid. Once we make it to Nibelheim, everyone but our stuffed pal is shocked to see that the entire town is still standing. And in fact, it looks to be thriving. Turns out after Sephiroth destroyed this place, Shinra rebuilt it as a facility to take care of those who have been Mako poisoned. This whole situation is extremely disorienting for Cloud and Tifa. So while Kate Sith attempts to access a Shinra terminal, everyone takes some time to cool off and explore town for a bit. Eventually, Cloud will wander into the inn where he stayed with Sephiroth during their mission, and this will bring back some memories of Zack. I like this change from the original a lot because it adds a little more context to what's going on in Cloud's head. Not to mention, I think the whole Zack scenario comes on a little too suddenly in the original. It doesn't feel very earned when it happens, despite how interesting it is. Although I like this change, again, I would like it a lot more if it weren't for the whole separate realities thing. If they kept hinting to us that Zack existed without all the other context we're getting from the parallel world, it would be a lot more intriguing and impactful in this moment. Instead, it just sort of feels like, oh wow, he's finally confronting his memories a little bit. Anyways, after some sightseeing, Kate Sith tells us that we need special access from another terminal to get info on the ancient temple. There's a guy in town that can give us access to one, but he's at the reactor, so we need to make our way up there with Tifa and Yuffie. And as we pass by the river, we get another memory of Zack. Again, it's the same situation. I would like this addition more if not for a certain something else being in the game. But I find it interesting that Cloud does bring this up to Tifa in the same moment and says he needs to tell Aerith. And strangely, Tifa asks him to let her bring it up to her since they're close. I don't totally understand why, maybe I'm missing something, but it feels like this is Square metagaming those in the know again. They keep setting up these subplots that might change the story a bit, but then instead of pursuing any of them, they are all just pushed under the rug one way or the other. I just feel like I'm being baited over and over again for something more interesting to come out of these changes, and then we are given nothing. It's not a good feeling. That aside, we eventually grab the keycard we needed and then end up in the Shinra Manor for a solo Kate's section. Following some box throwing shenanigans and a couple boss fights, we'll have access to the information on where the ancient temple is. Meanwhile, we meet some dude called Vincent that awakes from his coffin and he wants to have a quick fight with us. He's like a vampire or something, I'm not sure. I don't really understand Vincent very well, and I don't think Vincent does either. Following that, Kate Sith gives us a lead on where the temple is, but there's one final problem. We need a key. Luckily, he's pretty sure it's at the Golden Saucer, and we make our way back to Minigame Paradise. While catching a plane to our next destination, Vincent ends up tagging along and silently jumps into the back of the plane with us. Turns out he has some unfinished business with Sephiroth as well. On our way, the plane malfunctions and starts to crash. Sid then turns the plane into a boat, and we make our way back to Costa del Sol and finally to the Golden Saucer. One important thing to note here is that Rebirth completely skips going to Rocket Town. In the original, it's the first thing we would do after going through Nibelheim and where we get introduced to Sid. Then we would take the plane, crash it, and turn it into a boat and head towards the Golden Saucer for the key to the ancient temple. It makes sense Rocket Town was left out considering how different its storyline would need to play out at this point. And it seems like they try to make Rebirth with as few large altercations to the story as possible, while Part 3 will likely be full of them. And who knows, maybe they'll even remove things like Rocket Town entirely. Because I'm not sure how important it is for us to take a rocket into space to try and blow up a giant comet coming towards us. That, and maybe there won't even be a comet this time. On top of that, knowing how much Square likes to expand things, they'd probably be tempted to make a huge space dungeon that you'll need to explore that has an entire questline from some distant Gi relative that lives on another planet. Although considering just how ridiculous some of these quests are in Rebirth, doing space stuff for aliens might fit in pretty well. Or maybe instead of a ridiculous side quest, they'll add in some crazy 3D asteroids minigame to safely guide a rocket into the comet. And speaking of ridiculous minigames, brings us back to the Golden Saucer, but version 2.0. Coming back here for the key to the ancient temple will open up more difficulties for the minigames you already know and love. Anyways, this whole part is not too important, even though it was pretty fun and I probably played minigames for like 5 hours straight once I got here. Although while running around the Gold Saucer, inevitably you'll find Dio in the Colosseum. We'll ask about the key to the ancient temple, and he says he'll give it to us on one condition. We face Don Corneo in a big fight and win. Of course, we agree. It's a win-win. Beat the heck out of that stupid slumlord and get a key to where we need to go. After our fill of minigames, we can take a rest at our hotel room before the big day. This will cause Cloud to take a much-needed nap until someone once again gives us a knock on the door. Who shows up this time is again based on whoever you had the most relationship points with. You'll possibly go on a little outing with the boys, a dog, one of the girls, or even just Barrett. Whoever comes will take you to the theater and see a performance of Loveless, a silly little story about love's true kiss. It's a bit over the top and again makes another weird rhythm-like minigame that just kinda sucks. This mediocre mixture where you can hardly tell what's happening on the screen behind the glowing lights infuriates me. Like, I'd much rather have an overly complicated DDR-like thing that makes the character dance fight or something else ridiculous in the background. I don't know, I think when you've made the cutscene in the background more interesting than the minigame itself, that's a huge mistake. After some button mashing, Aerith will go on stage to belt out a powerful yet melancholic song that does a great job of conveying how she feels about Cloud, the journey, and everything else in between. When the singing ends, everyone leaves to take a ride on the Sky Wheel, which is just a VR Ferris wheel of sorts, and depending on your date, you'll get very different scenes of an intimate moment with whoever showed up at your door. More importantly, if your date is Tifa, Cloud will ask if she talked to Aerith about Zack yet. And if it's Aerith, he'll ask if Tifa has talked to her about something important yet. And they both basically answer no, even though they did in fact talk about it, leaving us in the dark about what Aerith thinks about the whole thing, which I guess might come up in the next game, who knows. The next day is the tournament battle against Don Corneo and his goons. We fight him, win, and then the Turks show up, of course. Turns out they would also like the key to the ancient temple. We get a small intermission as a courtesy, which I think is hilarious, and then we fight them, win, and then once again out of nowhere, another challenger approaches, Shinra's president Rufus. He shows up to fight Cloud alone. This is like the equivalent of Jeff Bezos showing up at a wrestling match to take on the winner.
Jeffrey Bezos,
After this ridiculous series of events, Rude throws Kate Sith the key and he runs away with it. We chase our cat around the golden saucer until he eventually hands the key over to the Turks. This part I hate a lot. No one even questions Kate Sith at all. It's just complete disappointment and resentment from everyone. You would think the party would at least inquire about something, like how he knew the Turks would be here, or anything else. But no, instead they just say he sucks and they completely abandon him. No one asks why he did it, how he knew the Turks would be there, or anything else. Instead, everyone just says he sucks and they completely abandon him. What makes this hard for me to grasp is how they've been treating Cloud the whole time. He's always forgiven for when he goes schizo mode and starts turning on people, but when it comes to Kate Sith, they immediately banish him from the group for his actions. I guess giving an important item to the enemy is far worse than trying to kill a party member. It feels as if Rebirth is just being dramatic simply to be dramatic instead of giving an actual reason for it later on. It doesn't make sense to remove Kate Sith from the party. As far as I'm aware, Kate Sith doesn't do anything during this time where he's away, so it doesn't even resolve anything. There's also no reason why Kate Sith needs to be the one to give the ancient temple key over to the Turks. And at the very least, they could have made him more cunning about it to make it look more like an accident. There's so many different ways this scenario could have played out, but they choose the one where Kate Sith gets completely kicked out of the party. This doesn't happen in the original, it doesn't lead to anything in the remake, and it makes the party look more hypocritical and dumb than usual, so what was the point? Worst of all, this happens when you reach the final chapter that's available for you to explore the entire world. It's just an incredibly strange choice that I can't find any justifiable reasons for. Maybe I'm just a salty Kate Sith fan, but certainly I'm not the only one who felt this was contrived or annoying. If it was a good story beat, or there was a good reason for Kate Sith to not be included in the ancient temple scenario, then I would probably be more okay with it. But the point is that it seemed wholly unnecessary. In fact, it's even stranger considering just how important Kate Sith is for the end of the ancient temple plot. The only reason I can come up with for this happening is that Square didn't want to add him to either Aerith or Cloud's group when they split them up in the temple. That and him showing up at the end of the ancient temple to save the party is kind of his redemption. But anyways, considering the parties are equal and they both end up in a kerfuffle with the Turks, I imagine that's why they excluded him from the temple. But I don't think it would have actually hurt one side or the other to add him in. On top of that, I don't think him showing up out of nowhere makes the redemption of his character any better here than the original plot. If anything, it makes the whole scenario more unbelievable and far less satisfying. So all in all, I just don't get it. Maybe Square was trying to save on development time by not including more party members, or maybe they really thought this was a lot better. Who knows? As for the ancient temple itself, I think it's just okay. I don't really like the ways we traverse around the space too much, which is mostly done by using a switch that allows us to change the gravity of the room. I think this could be an interesting way to design an area, but it really felt like I put a damper on things in the moment, and was overall just really disorienting. I think it could have been more interesting if we were able to get a better look at the overall space and have more reasons to decide which way to turn the gravity. As it is, I was simply guessing and then trying to figure out where I could go now after the gravity was flipped. The only hints you're given are where these vines lead you toward, but beyond that, nothing seemed to give me a lot of direction. I hate to say this, but this is one of the few areas where I actually prefer the original game. I think the interactions here are a lot more fun and don't feel bogged down by the story like they do in Rebirth. Even this stupid clock pathway thing is fun, even if it doesn't make any sense, or running between these boulders to not get smashed. But maybe even worse than some of the navigation of the new temple, I didn't really like this whole narrative of Cloud killing people thing is suddenly bad. It again feels out of place, like they're trying too hard to show Sephiroth is in control or something. Not to mention we've been kind of ruthlessly killing people this entire time, especially Shinra soldiers. See for instance when I simultaneously take out 20 of these guys with a single fireball just before this scene. Now don't get me wrong, I'm not a psychopath. I understand that people getting killed in these cutscenes are shown to be surrendering and are pleading for their life. So yeah, it's obvious to see that they're trying to portray Cloud as being this heartless asshole in this moment, and they really dramatize it up. But I also don't think Cloud is entirely in the wrong for doing this. These people were just trying to end our lives, so it's not like they aren't a potential threat. And overall for me, there's just a bit too much distance between this narrative and the actual gameplay here. Further into the temple, we end up encountering a dragon that is here for some reason. Don't worry, we'll talk about him more in a later combat section. After this, the group gets split up and the gameplay changes quite a bit. In one section, Aerith leads a group and Cloud in the other. Both are trying to make their way towards the Black Materia. Eventually, both groups end up in their own battle against a couple of Turks. Cloud goes a little schizo again and nearly tries to kill Elena, one of the Turks, for good before Tifa is able to stop him. Then each party member, except for Cloud, has to go through some sort of vision quest based on their previous experience before they can go to the final room. Everyone is given a short solo section that is more like a little trauma dump for each of them. Most of this is pretty brutal and is kind of a lot to follow one after the other. It feels pretty weird they've placed this all here instead of spacing them out a bit more throughout the game. Barrett sees his wife, but then goes through losing his family and his arm again. Red 13 relives Hojo capturing him and experimenting on him. Yuffie relives losing her best friend and comrade. Aerith relives escaping Shinra as a child and losing her mother. Maybe this is why they didn't include Cait Sith, because he didn't have any comparable trauma. Or maybe robots can't have a vision quest, I don't know. Everyone comes out of the rooms looking super depressed, and Aerith tries to give an uplifting speech. But then an impatient Cloud kills the final droplet of happiness left in the room with a "Are you done yet? Let's go already." Through the next door, we're given a little history lesson on the Cetra, Genova, and of course the Black Materia, and then we fight a demon wall. And after all of this, we finally make it to the Black Materia. Cloud runs up to grab it and starts going a bit crazy, and then the entire temple starts to crumble Indiana Jones style. Here is where Cait Sith pops in out of nowhere to save the day. Because of his heroic actions, we're able to escape the temple, and then outside, Cait Sith too comes out to greet us. And then next, Sephiroth is here looking for the Black Materia. And then there's this whole lengthy scene of Cloud trying his best to not hand over the materia to Sephiroth. I like Remake's rendition of this scene a lot. At first I thought the part where we walk forward as Cloud here could have been a little better if he instead walked forward no matter what input was given. Like holding backwards would still make you do the silly animation, but you would walk forward while doing it. But looking back, I feel like this actually works pretty well just the way it is. It still won't let you walk backwards no matter what input is given, and I think that's good enough to show just how out of control Cloud is in this moment. Anyways, once Cloud hands over the Black Materia to Sephiroth, he sees Aerith struggling to keep her balance, as she always has, as she fights off the Whispers attacking her. Cloud, seeing this, eventually makes him come too, and Aerith notices and says, "Welcome back." Except not really, because in English, she actually says, Now, I'm not usually this much of a translation stickler, but this is an important moment, and this seemingly small change creates an enormous difference in what Aerith's reaction communicates. Any annoying weeb like me listening to this in Japanese would obviously know that Aerith does not say Cloud in this moment, but instead says, which means welcome home, or welcome back. More importantly, this signals to the audience that Aerith has an understanding of what's happening to Cloud, as it has been hinted to us throughout much of the game, like when she talks about how she's looking for the real Cloud. So why in the world do they not have her say something similar to welcome back in English? I don't know, it makes no sense. Instead, we just get her yelling his name, which doesn't give anywhere the same amount of meaning to me and makes her look helpless instead of showing she is happy to see he's back to normal. There's little translation freedoms like this all over the place throughout the game, which is the usual for most Japanese to English translations. And they typically don't alter what was said enough for me to be annoyed, or think that it changes the story or characters significantly. But this one bugs me the most. Again, they usually don't matter that much, but this one is just so obvious and makes the scene that much worse, and for what purpose? Because who says welcome back to someone after coming out of a psychotic episode? I don't know the reasons, and I'm not sure I want to know. I will say, with the context of her saying welcome back in one language and then watching it with that context in English of her just saying Cloud, I can see why the localizers might have thought this works. With the knowledge of what is said in Japanese, I can see how they thought this would get the idea across. But this just brings us back to expectations. Because the translators knew what was intended to be said here, it made sense. But without context, I imagine a lot of people watching this scene did not get the idea that she recognizes Cloud as himself again. Translations aside, after Aerith falls, Cloud leaps off to try and save her, and they dive into a parallel world. I feel like I've already made my disdain for these parts mostly clear, so let's just move past it and go on towards what happens in the City of the Ancients afterwards, where the most infamous 7th scene takes place. This is really the only section in Rebirth that gets a huge cut, which is sad because it's one of my favorite areas. But I have to imagine that because we do come back here later, that the final part of this trilogy will include some sort of expanded City of the Ancients. Anyways, after Cloud returns from the parallel world, he wakes up surrounded by the party in the ancient forest, but Aerith is missing. Each party member has a private chat with him about what's going on as they move towards where they hope to find Aerith. As they approach the city, Whispers attack, and not long after they find a giant wall of Whispers, and everyone but Cloud uses their strength to create an opening for him. After passing through, we find ourselves in an ancient city flooded with Whispers. We follow a trail of ascending stairs until we can faintly hear Aerith reciting some kind of prayer. Cloud tries to approach her, but the Whispers are holding him back. Even still, he desperately marches toward her, pushing the Whispers out of his way, but he suddenly starts to lose control of himself again and starts to raise his sword above her. We watch Cloud stare down Aerith while his body is no longer under his control. He tries to pull the weight of his arms in different directions to no avail. And then at the last second, we see Sephiroth fall from above, and Cloud regains control for just long enough to deflect Sephiroth's sword from piercing Aerith. Or at least that's what it looks like. For a moment, it seems like Aerith has been saved, but instead we see her fall to the ground and Cloud catching her. Still, something seems off, as the screen flashes between scenes of Cloud crying and then holding his tears back as if we are teleporting between worlds or timelines. So first of all, I love the visuals of this scene. It does a great job of capturing the grim beauty of this moment. The camera panning to line up Aerith's body with Sephiroth's sword as we are shifting between realities is a pretty cool touch. And it was nice to see Square continue to echo the original by lining up the music with the bounce of the holy materia. The whole thing remains just as chilling. While this scene is great, it's also incredibly confusing. It seems that for a moment Cloud altered fate and found a way to save Aerith, but then moments later he turns around and she's dead. So it's hard to know if we're snapping between realities, memories, or something else entirely. And all we can wonder is what is happening and why. When the reality flip-flop stops, it looks like Cloud is crying, but it still remains unclear whether or not Aerith is dead. And I get the sense that Cloud believes she's alive. I don't think he knows which reality he's in. And when he lays down Aerith to fight Sephiroth, he says, "Wait for me." Well, that's what he says in Japanese. I hate to bring this up again, but in English he says, "I got this," which just feels so much weaker, and if confusion is what they're going for, "wait for me" is so much better. Once Cloud sets down Aerith, the rest of the crew arrives and we start a showdown against Jenova and Sephiroth. And Zack even pops in from his parallel world for a surprise appearance. This entire fight sequence is epic, but it also fucking sucks to do. This entire fight, if you include all the cutscenes, takes nearly an hour. And 50 minutes into this never-ending setlist of battle after battle with no breaks, Square finally pits you against Sephiroth 1v1 in a dreamy negative white space. And then Aerith somehow comes in out of nowhere to help, making it a 2v1. And this left me with a pretty big problem when I did this for my first time. Aerith had no materia equipped. And if you want to change her loadout, well, that would mean restarting the nearly entire 50-minute long sequence to get here all over again just to be able to give her a proper setup. The game gives you only a single space within the entire fight to change any materia, and it's when we fight as just Zack and Cloud, the most useless time imaginable throughout this entire sequence to allow a loadout change to happen. And of course, you can only change Cloud. I know we haven't talked about combat yet, and don't worry, we will soon. I just need to express how upsetting it was to realize this. I mean, to be fair to me, I thought with 99% certainty that Aerith would die, and I wouldn't be able to use her in whatever fight transpired afterwards. And I can't be the only idiot who's played the original game and thought this, so why not give us the ability to change loadouts before this fight begins? I mean, they already completely heal you, so I really don't get it. So I refused to reload my game, and surprisingly, it only took me a few tries, and I beat him despite how annoying it was. And after this wild battle that crosses universes, Cloud approaches Aerith and simply tells her to wake up. And seemingly, she awakes and Cloud smiles. Again, it's confusing as to what's really happening here. We've seen her alive and dead. And then the game transitions to the rest of the crew looking completely depressed. Everyone is mourning Aerith's death, except for Cloud. Cloud can see and talk to Aerith, and whether or not he's hallucinating is still unknown. A little later, we see Zack sitting in the church thinking about what in the world just happened to him, and considering how to reunite the worlds once again. Then we're placed in the final scene, with Sid humming Final Fantasy's main theme while everyone is trying to fix the plane together. And much of the crew is still sulking. All the while, when we see this through Cloud's perspective, Aerith can be seen carefully listening in on the conversation around her, even though she's not truly there, at least I think. As Cloud stares into the clear materia Aerith gave him, Harry Potter in the Sorcerer's Stone style, he notices something is in his pocket. He's somehow in possession of the black materia. I remember thinking that at the end of Remake, there was bound to be a ton of changes for the next game considering how it ended. But while playing through Rebirth, everything seemed to end up almost exactly the same, until now. And the amount of differences in this ending sequence alone leaves me wondering what won't change for the next game. Thinking about some kind of change occurring can be exciting, but it's also terrifying. Rebirth has a good track record so far, but I still find myself worried about what's to come considering the inclusion of parallel worlds. Most of all, it just makes me worried that they'll do something even dumber somehow. On top of that, I don't know if the parallel worlds can be reconciled into an ending that will be satisfying to me. But I also don't think this means the overall story will be done poorly. I think the adventure to get to the end will still be well told and fun to play through. Still, when I think about how Square will tie everything together at the end, it's hard to imagine how. But no matter how it does end up, I'm pretty sure I'll enjoy Nomura's wild ride one way or the other. While I have a lot of reservations about the story and what will happen next, something I am confident about is that the battle system in the next game will still be great, if not better, because Rebirth is some of the most fun combat I've ever played in a JRPG. In the Remake series, Square masterfully merges the tactics of old with the action of new. There is never a battle that feels dull, and there's always something new and exciting to try. I hope it came through in the earlier section that despite the parallel worlds and my many other dislikes, that I still really like Rebirth. And I'm happy to tell you it only gets better because the combat of Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is by far my favorite part about it. Let's get the basics out of the way. First of all, every character has their own style of attacking. For example, characters like Kate Sith and Cloud can use a melee attack as well as a ranged attack. Melee will be the default, while range will be used if you dodge and then immediately attack. Although some characters are strictly range unless under a special circumstance such as Barret and Aerith, and some are strictly melee like Tifa and Red 13. Meanwhile, Yuffie is the most versatile of all attackers as she can swap between ranged and melee with her special ability at will. Speaking of abilities, every character has a similar kind of special ability that is unique to them. Some do damage, and others change how the character feels to play completely. For instance, Barret's ability is a very strong attack that charges over time, and Cloud's will simply let him change how he attacks. And finding ways to incorporate these abilities will be the key to finding success in the battles of Rebirth. Another unique part of each character are the more general abilities they can use. These become available when they have an ATB charge, which is a resource that builds over time when damaging enemies. Character abilities will range from being supportive, like healing the party, to gambling on a random spell by throwing dice as Kate Sith. These are typically the reasons why you would favor one companion over another, and will likely determine the way you want to play the game. Most importantly for ATB to use an ability, there is a menu that freezes the game, giving players time to pick and choose which ability to cast for each character. You might notice that this menu doesn't completely pause the game, and instead slowly plays out the current battle frame by frame. This is where the mix of tactics and action step in. Although you can bind abilities and spells to certain button combos instead of using this menu, and I found that after getting more comfortable with the game, this felt really fluid and fun to use. But when it comes to controlling each character during a tough boss, it becomes imperative to use the slow menu during important windows. This way you can input the right ability for each character to use at just the right moment to do as much damage as possible. This is the part of Remake and Rebirth's combat that is so genius to me, and a big reason as to why it is so fun to use. It masterfully combines both turn-based RPGs and action RPGs into a single system. It really is the best of both worlds working in parallel. Having this real-time combat where you can control each character and react to enemy attacks while also being able to incorporate interesting strategies across your whole party at the same time is thrilling to pull off. And the best parts of this combat system become especially clear during the critical moments of a boss fight. But before I show you that, there's another important mechanic that we have to go over, the stagger meter. This meter increases a little bit each time an enemy is either damaged or blocked. And nearly every enemy also has conditions under which they can become pressured, meaning their stagger bar will increase much more quickly. And they'll also be more susceptible to getting their attacks interrupted. The conditions for pressuring an enemy are usually things like interrupting a specific attack, breaking a certain part of their body, or blocking at the correct time. And some enemies are easily pressured by just using a spell they are weak to. Scanning each and every enemy and learning how to play around pressuring them only makes the game more fun. After pressuring an enemy, or just smacking them for long enough, the stagger meter will inevitably fill up, and cause the enemy to be stunned and be more vulnerable to attacks, increasing their potency by a certain percentage. This window only lasts a short while, so this is where it becomes really crucial to efficiently squeeze out as much damage as possible within the time limit you have, which is done by using this wonderful ATB freeze menu, as well as making sure each character is ready for the stagger by keeping their ATB bars full. Something that has been much improved from Remake is how the stagger phase works for bosses. Remake had this awful problem where bosses would often be staggered and then immediately move into a new phase, completely resetting the meter. This made it feel as if my efforts to stagger an enemy were wasted or worthless. Luckily, Square took note of this issue, and the boss timings around staggers feel far better in Rebirth. On top of the timing just being better, they've also made it so bosses won't move into a new phase until they're done being stunned from a stagger. And to prevent players from completely obliterating a boss during a single stagger window, they've added stopping points. These make it so you can only do so much damage to a boss before they phase, which surprisingly makes bosses feel pretty good. This is largely due to the limit not being the same exact HP percentage as when you would naturally phase a boss. For example, a boss may have a flag for phasing at 70% HP, but the max damage you can do to the enemy before they phase might actually be getting them to 60% HP before you would hit a stopping point. Essentially, this gives players a substantial window during a stagger where the damage you do won't feel wasted, without also ruining the rest of the encounter. This was a consistent problem with many of the bosses in Remake, but almost never in Rebirth, so I have to give props to Square for finding such an elegant solution to this frustration. And honestly, I think they should figure out a way to patch Remake with this idea, and I can't imagine it would be too terribly difficult to implement. I'm mostly suggesting this because there's this weird problem with the game, where Square just keeps getting better at designing the series, and by the time the third and final game rolls out, it's going to feel far better than the previous games. So I wonder if they'll somehow reconcile this after finishing, or if they even care. The final and maybe most important use of ATB is for casting spells. These are basically more universal abilities, meaning every character can use them. They come from an item you can equip to your characters called materia. These are a bit complicated and I'll go more in depth on them in a moment, but in general spells have varying levels of power based on how strong the materia is. Rebirth then goes further and adds synergy attacks. These are kind of like separate abilities that use their own ATB system, but for two characters to use at the same time. The synergy moves available to you is based upon who is in your party, and instead of using ATB, they use synergy, which you can build up on each character by simply spending ATB. Once two characters have enough synergy built up, they can perform a powerful move that does damage, and it typically gives them a buff, such as doing more stagger damage or making spells like fire cost 0 MP. There are also more simple synergy abilities that cost nothing, and they can be very useful. For example, if you have Barret and Red 13 in your party, they can create a barricade and take highly reduced damage while they guard together, essentially turning them into super tanks for as long as you'd like. These kind of abilities can become critical to use in some fights designed around these characters. For example, there's a rock boss in the Mithril Mines right before Junon that you must fight as only Red and Barret. I think this boss is actually a lot of fun and really well designed around both of these characters. For example, the boss eventually uses an attack that is a constant spray of crystals that will do a ton of damage. It can't really be totally immune because a perfect block doesn't last long enough to cover each and every spray, and I don't believe it's possible to dodge them all. The solution then, that's really only necessary on hard mode, becomes to use their synergy ability to tank it and very significantly reduce the damage it does. And even this seemingly simple synergy ability has multiple use cases. For instance, this boss also has a very high damaging attack that hits everything in melee range. But because the synergy ability teleports the other character behind you, it can also be used to help the other party member, like Red, from getting clobbered and dodge all the damage. Synergy abilities like this are great additions to your arsenal that can make the game a lot more fun by allowing you to find creative solutions to enemy attacks. But Rebirth doesn't necessitate this creativity, and of course includes a few basic ways to avoid damage. For example, most attacks can be blocked to negate a lot of the damage, and can even make you completely immune to it if it's done at the correct timing, which is referred to as a perfect block. Although some enemy attacks cannot be blocked at all and instead must be dodged. Attacks that are unblockable come with a warning symbol and have an exclamation point in the middle. Finally, there is one way to do a huge amount of damage while also being completely immune to enemy attacks, and this is called a limit break. These charge up over time and typically charge faster based upon the damage you dish out to enemies and how much damage you've taken or blocked. Although most of the character's limit breaks do a ton of damage, Aerith is the exception, whether it's fully healing them or making them completely immune to physical damage. Alongside Rebirth's excellent combination of combat styles, another impressive feat is how distinct each character feels to play from each other, each having different animations for dodging, guarding, and casting spells. And not to mention the abilities everyone gets in their base stats make them unique in what they excel in, yet all of them are malleable enough to be viable in many playstyles. The difference between playing a character like Cloud and then switching to Aerith is apparent even visually. Cloud has far more movement and flexibility in his kit, while Aerith has next to none. It's a bit comparable to playing a glass cannon mage versus a high mobility thief class. This also comes through in their potential damage output and scaling. Although eventually as you scale towards the damage cap of 9,999, this becomes less and less apparent. Personally, the character I had the most fun playing was Tifa. She has a ton of insane offensive capabilities, from how swiftly she can block and dodge to the sheer amount of damage she can output. It all creates a feeling of smooth reactiveness that culminates in a ton of fun and satisfaction. On the other hand, my least favorite character to play is Aerith. Half the reason is due to her having the worst dodge and attack animations by far, meaning it can be a real pain to build up her ATB bar, putting her at a severe disadvantage, especially when controlling her, since enemies tend to target whoever you are currently playing as. Consequently, she does have some incredibly powerful tools in her arsenal, such as being able to spend a single ATB to allow everyone to cast spells twice is probably one of the best abilities in the game. But she's just so miserable to play as that it doesn't feel worth it, especially considering how slowly she builds ATB, so I almost never put her in my party for anything difficult in the game. Instead, for most of my playtime, I used Cloud, Tifa, and Cait Sith. While Tifa was definitely the best feeling character to play, Cait Sith was a close second just because of how silly it is. It was surprisingly fun to play as this big dumb stuffed animal, partially due to his unique mechanic of summoning the giant Moogle. They designed a bunch of interesting abilities surrounding it, like using him as a bomb or just letting him tank for the party. My favorite thing to do as Cait Sith was throwing his dice. Doing this will have him cast a couple spells based on whatever numbers get rolled. This can give the party some really strong effects, like making them completely immune to physical damage for a short duration. On top of this, you can also move and attack the entire time Cait is on the Moogle, which sort of devolved into me running around and shooting bubbles like an idiot and constantly throwing dice. I had a blast doing this ridiculous gimmick, but Cait Sith can also be deceptively strong, especially when combining his Knuckle Punch with Tifa's overwhelming power, both of which abilities increase how much damage an enemy will take during a stagger. Using these together can cause enemies to take upwards of 400% more damage, letting Cloud or whoever else do huge amounts of damage. Again, the only constraint being the damage cap, making this combo more and more insignificant as the game goes on, but still fun to do. So I hope Square finds a way for us to remove the damage cap much earlier in the next game. While you do have the ability to go over the cap in Rebirth, the game must essentially be totally completed besides some of the later simulator missions in order to unlock it. Coming back to the spells I discussed earlier, one of the most important parts of combat is of course the unique RPG elements that the game offers. And materia is 7's bread and butter, and in fact has been a huge inspiration for minigames to come after it, with Path of Exile probably being the most notable for how they really take this idea to the next level. Here's how it works. Materia is sorted into several different types. There's magic, support, independent, command, and summon materia. Magic materia simply let you cast a spell associated with it. This can be anything from an elemental attack like Thundaga to a supportive cure or barrier spell. And then there's support materia, which is the cousin of magic and will typically add some kind of modifier to these. Modifiers will range from anything like allowing the spell to be cast on several different characters or enemies at once, or to simply giving you MP back based on the amount of damage you've done. Linking combinations of magic and support materia tend to be the most impactful and important when it comes to creating strong synergies. Here's what equipping materia looks like. Each character can have 2 pieces of gear that materia can be slotted into. These will have a number of slots which will either be independent or linked with another one. For example, if you equip a lightning materia into a slot with a link, you can put something like MP absorb into the other one, allowing you to get MP back on use of lightning. And more importantly, there will never be slots with more than a single link, meaning your synergy is slightly limited but not entirely, because you can equip the same spell materia twice to add another modifier. For example, let's say I already have a lightning linked with a materia absorb, I could add another lightning and link that one with something else like all. Meaning when I cast lightning, it will now attack multiple enemies at the same time and give me MP back for each strike. Given the amount of different magic and support materia, these alone create a huge amount of variance in the kinds of strategies you can employ. Beyond these, there are more simple materia that don't need links like the independent and command materia. Independent materia is usually fairly defensive and will give you bonuses such as decreasing how much damage an enemy will do to you when you block, or more simply give you 25% bonus HP or some other stat. Meanwhile, command materia will give you a new ability that are strong on their own, like Chakra. This materia will give you an ability that allows you to heal a certain percentage of your missing health, which can be really strong in the right scenarios. Materia has surprisingly hardly changed at all from the original game, keeping most of the systems and interactions intact. This includes everything from the different materia you can use to how they're equipped and how much of them can be used and even how they level up. And when you consider how different the combat systems are between the remake and the original game, this is a really impressive feat, with the only large change being how limited you are on some of the more powerful materia such as all, as well as the most powerful materia, summons. Each character now has their own slot that is separate from their equipment that is reserved for a single summon materia, the only downside being that you are typically only allowed a single summon per fight, and this is only after a successful stagger. On the upside, summons tend to be very powerful for the ATB investment they require, allowing you to cast some spells as strong as Re-Raise, which reses a party member upon dying for just 2 ATB. While materia is an incredibly fun system to play around with, Square does not give you a whole lot of flexibility in how you swap them around. For one, there is no way to save a set of materia, so if you would like to change things around, you'll have to take the time to individually move each materia from slot to slot over and over again. I think this is one of the largest things holding the game back. The amount of time I spent on only moving materia around got to be a bit insane. Maybe the most frustrating thing about all of this that almost made steam rise from my head was when I discovered there was a menu that let you see every character materia all on a single page. I didn't see this until I had already played the game for 110 hours. So every time I wanted to change materia around before this, I was going through like 10 different menus trying to organize everything. It took forever, and the game doesn't really teach you this. I found this problem to be even further exacerbated when doing my hard mode playthrough. This is mostly due to the fact that many bosses in hard mode will often require a specific setup of materia to be killed with ease, and then afterwards you'll likely want to swap back to a just running around and killing random things materia set. So it's kind of baffling to me that they didn't realize this during their playtest and add a way to create sets of materia. Although this materia page was nice after I found it, the amount of time it required to move materia around was still a little crazy. And considering they'll probably only add a lot more materia to the next game, they'll really need to find a way to make the system more manageable. Now for a big change of pace, I kind of want to talk about the lock-on system for a little bit, because there's a weird problem when locking on to an enemy in this game, which is that sometimes I would find it annoying to try and look somewhere else while staying focused on the same enemy, because if I do that, then I would switch my target. The lock-on doesn't work like I would expect it to in most situations, because if I lock onto a target, then I expect my target should never change while I am locked, sort of like how tab targeting works in World of Warcraft. I should be able to stay focused on whichever enemy I want to attack and then turn the camera to face any direction and my target should not change, but this does not happen in Rebirth by default. So my point again is that if you try to move the camera and look somewhere else while locked onto something already, you will change targets, which to me completely negates the point of locking onto a target. The way this system works is almost unbelievable to me. But then I realized it was almost never actually a problem until the difficulty of the fights ramped up enough to where I needed to focus on 2 different enemies at the same time. So I can see why Square designed it to work this way as default, but I think it's the wrong perspective to have. But maybe this is mostly because of my own philosophy on how the controls should work, and Square violates it. But let's first understand how they work. In Rebirth, the right analog stick is in control of 2 things during combat, and depending on your perspective, one of these 2 things is likely more important than the other, one being camera control and the other target control. Now, based on the default settings, I can only believe Square's perspective is that camera control is more important, although not for the player, but for the game. Square's philosophy seems to be that the game should be in charge of the camera, while the player should be focused on what they currently want to target. This is the problem that arises when assigning 2 actions to a single control stick. A priority must be given, so ideally they would just decouple these actions from each other. But if you for some reason had to put them on the same control, that changes things. And from my perspective, the player having control over the camera is more important than changing your target. Although it is possible to do this correctly while having a single control tied to both actions. There just needs to be an input that would allow you to keep that target, a lock-on button that makes your character focus that thing even when you move the camera somewhere else. That's what a true lock-on system is. Rebirth doesn't actually have this kind of functionality by default. It's more of the camera will focus this enemy until you move it, rather than a target this enemy with your attacks. Again, my opinion is that the lock-on button should make it so my character always attacks what I'm locked onto, no matter where the camera is pointed. Because I feel like that's the point of a lock-on system. Otherwise, it's just a camera focus system, which is not at all the same. Although luckily this camera setting can be changed into a true lock-on system, but I found that it made it really uncomfortable to play the game. Turns out after you play a game for 100+ hours with the same controls, altering those controls is really annoying. But the problem was that I found a boss that required my attention be split between both enemies. And no matter your strategy, this boss requires you to know what attacks they are both doing at all times, which meant I had to get uncomfy for a little bit. The boss in question that made me change camera settings is a dual summon boss, Odin and Alexander. Believe it or not, this was only the 3rd most frustrating experience I had in this game for combat. The second came quickly after, which was the Phoenix and Karaja fight. And lastly, the final fight with Sephiroth that takes like an hour and it has no breaks. Anyways, the Alexander and Odin fight is difficult because nearly all of Odin's attacks must be either perfectly blocked or dodged. Because getting hit more than a few times means he'll start casting an attack that will instantly wipe out the entire squad. This fight is actually pretty fun against just Odin, but adding another enemy into the mix makes it far more of a puzzle to figure out. I actually ended up liking this fight a lot. I think it was a really cool challenge. The only frustrating thing again was trying to make the camera controls work. Because the most important part of the fight was finding the right time to block Alexander's ranged attacks so they don't line up with Odin's attacks, which required you to be able to see both enemies at the same time but have your focus on Odin. And this is actually mostly due to you want to hit only one of them but not both, considering getting one out of the fight as soon as possible is certainly the best way to win, as well as they both get stronger and more difficult to deal with as they progress through their various phases. So again, camera control during this fight was far more important than any other mechanic I had previously encountered. And this is when I realized just how poorly the camera works because I never really had to change my targets that often before. Now again, to be fair to Square, I think the default camera controls are suitable for almost the entire game. Usually all the enemies fit on your screen fairly well, and the most difficult fights are typically just a single enemy, meaning a true lock-on system really isn't that necessary. But I think if they want to expand on their design, the difficulty, and the different kinds of interactions the player can have with bosses, the camera system needs an update, especially if they are considering adding more intricate fights in that compound in complexity such as many of these dual summon bosses. The player will likely want to stay locked onto a certain enemy while doing that instead of the camera deciding which enemy should be targeted. As far as boss design throughout most of Rebirth, I feel like they were pretty fun, whether I was playing on dynamic or hard. Although I do have some issues with a couple hard mode bosses. For example, a boss that I really liked on normal but hated on hard mode was the dragon in the ancient temple. First, to understand why I like this boss initially, we have to understand how bosses are typically approached in Rebirth, or at least the way I think is best to figure them out. The most important ability to bring to every boss fight is the Assess Materia. Using this ability will scan the boss and give you some incredibly important information about it, from how they become pressured as well as what elements they are weak to or resist. On top of that, many bosses also have special abilities, and Assess will typically relay information on how they work. For example, if we pull up Assess on the Ancient Dragon, we'll learn a few very important things. One, it's weak to ice, and it's immune to fire, meaning it's time to remove the heat and bring the blizzard. Secondly, we learn a bit about pressuring it. If we hit the pillars and they fall into the dragon, he'll become pressured. Good, that's useful info, and it seems like a fun mechanic to pull off. Lastly, if you break the chest of the dragon, it will reduce the range of his Crimson Breath. Not sure what that does, but it's probably important later. This fight is split into 2 different phases. In the first phase, there will be pillars on the edges of the map. The dragon will spit a bunch of fire at you, as dragons do. The range of the fire is quite large and has a quick turn radius, so one of my first instincts was to hide behind a pillar. Just kidding, my first actual instinct was to block it with Aerith so she could actually gain ATB at a decent rate. But it didn't take too long for me to realize I could just hide behind a pillar. And after I did, one of the party members then shouted something about hitting the pillar, and if you do, it will fall. I find that mechanics like these are pretty intuitive, fun, and rewarding. After smacking the dragon enough and he reaches the threshold to move into phase 2, he'll flip the room upside down, meaning you can no longer whop him with pillars. And then he starts flying around like a maniac, meaning it becomes pretty tough to hit him with a blizzard spell. Luckily, you can break his wings to pressure him and bring him to the ground. Now, if I had actually remembered what the SS told me, I might have considered trying to break the chest on my first playthrough to not get one-shot by his next ability. But I didn't. Instead, I just brute forced my way through it and tried to kill the dragon before it could kill me. Once again, I like this boss on normal and dynamic modes. It has a good amount of HP, it has a very strong move that is only avoidable if you do some mechanics correctly, but even if you do get hit by it, it's survivable if your party is topped off. I think it's a fun fight. The problem with this fight on hard mode is that you cannot reduce the range of his Crimson Breath. The move that will deplete your team of all their HP is completely unavoidable now. But this isn't told to you anywhere. In fact, the accessibility screen I'm showing to you now is from the hard mode version of this boss and does not mention this fact. Even worse, it still says the range can be reduced by breaking the chest. But I had no idea. So even after breaking his chest, which was super satisfying to pull off in hard mode actually, I was instantly demoralized when the words Crimson Breath 3 still came up on my screen as I watched my entire team melt away while I could do nothing about it. I think this is really bad, not only because SS doesn't tell you that this mechanic was removed for hard mode, but because the fight was actually much better designed with that option still being available to you. Mostly because to pull this off is actually really hard to do. I do like that it's not necessary in order to win the fight, because I'll explain what I ended up doing instead, but I did feel like my efforts were completely wasted when I learned it was simply not possible. Especially considering it took like an hour for me to get this set up right and pull it off. Because here's what I needed to do in order to make this work. First of all, before moving into phase 2, I had to make sure my entire party had full ATB bars. This is because there is no time to build ATB in the second phase before he casts Crimson Breath. It happens really fast. So as soon as I had control of my characters in phase 2, I had Aerith cast Thunder on the wings because it cannot miss. This had to be done as soon as possible because as soon as he fell to the ground, I had barely enough time to cast a single Blizzaga on his chest. This all basically needs to be done perfectly without getting hit, or else there isn't enough time to break his chest before he casts Crimson Breath. And after many attempts, I did it all just in time and crippled the chest right before he cast it, and then of course, I died. At first, I was in disbelief. I know the chest was crippled because the game told me as much, and just to make sure I wasn't crazy, I pulled it off a couple more times. And then when that didn't work, I did a Google search, and of course learned that mechanic was actually removed for hard mode. After realizing it doesn't work, I was pretty upset, mostly because I had to look up this information online to be sure I wasn't doing something wrong instead of the game just giving me that information. I don't think that's fun or interesting, I think it's fucking annoying and a waste of my time. After learning this, the strategy then became clear in my mind. If there's no way to stop it from happening, then I just have to use some gimmicks. I equipped everyone with Revive Earrings, which will bring a character back to life after dying once in a fight, as well as Mana Ward plus all on Tifa, which to my surprise actually made the Crimson Flame do basically no damage. And the first time I implemented this strategy, I beat the fight. It was that easy to pull off. Don't get me wrong, I like that you can use this kind of creative thinking to win the fight. Especially if you figure out this kind of thing pretty quickly, then I'm sure it feels good to win the fight that way. Again, the problem I have is that crippling the chest before the Crimson Flame actually comes out is really mechanically challenging to pull off, so why would you take that method away? It seems nonsensical to me. I just find that magnifying a mana wall to the party is far less interesting and kind of boring, and after learning that there was no other choice but to tank it, it only took less than a minute for me to find a solution, so I don't know, I just hate everything about this. The reason I hate this is that this is an issue that arises when designing a game where almost everything is avoidable, whether you do it by dodging at the right moment or simply immuning it by blocking with the correct timing, or even using the environment to block an attack like the pillars in this same dragon fight. Don't get me wrong, I love this kind of gameplay. I think it's super fun to play with. But when you force players to move away from this paradigm that's been set up, and instead make an attack unavoidable, it's almost always going to feel bad. Another part of this issue is that there's basically no reason to use a materia like Barrier throughout the rest of the game if players are skilled enough at blocking and dodging, especially someone playing the game on hard mode where employing perfect blocks and dodging become essential to win fights. So again, this makes it just feel really awkward to force the player to use some sort of gimmick out of nowhere. I know I've said this a lot, but I'll make the point one final time, that the worst part about the hard mode version of this fight is that Square is asking me to ignore all the interesting mechanics that made the game fun to strategize around, and instead win by using a gimmick. This is just weird when pretty much every other hard mode boss excelled by forcing you to notice and play around their unique mechanics, which was a lot of fun. Some of my favorite bosses to learn and play against were the summon bosses like Bahamut Arisen, although I could have done without the succeed or just die mechanics almost all of these bosses have, but besides those, they were a good time. On top of these, I think Chidley's solo challenges for each character are pretty fun to do and do a better job of avoiding these kind of gimmicks. Although bosses were typically even more enjoyable on hard mode, this wasn't true right away. I don't remember this issue happening in Remake, but once you begin hard mode in Rebirth, every enemy is the max level of 70. But I was only around level 50, and I didn't realize that everything was 20 plus levels higher than me, but I certainly felt it. I just thought it was going to be an absolutely insane challenge this time around. It makes me wish the levels were more clearly associated with each enemy, like near their HP bar. Because I don't mind that everything is level 70 in hard mode, but I find it to be an issue when there's no way to know that everything is 20 plus levels higher than me without a Google search. But once I did become aware of this information, I grinded out some levels, which almost took no time at all, and hard mode was much more enjoyable. While I have many criticisms of Rebirth, overall I think it's a fantastic JRPG. It tells a good story with a world that is as wondrous as it is goofy. And the combat is a joy throughout. In fact, I would love to see future Square games build on this kind of RPG action system even further. Still, if I could change anything, it would probably be the parallel worlds. These are a huge miss for me. I think there is so much potential for more impactful and interesting moments in this game's story that are unfortunately a bit diminished by the inclusion of these different realities, especially for players unfamiliar with the story. There are so many great changes from the original, but the single idea hinders them in ways I wish I didn't have to think about. But even so, I'll let Square cook. Like I said, I personally don't think it's salvageable, but I would be thrilled to see Square prove me wrong. Besides Square fixing the parallel worlds, here's some other things I'm hoping to see in the next game. For example, another improvement in the combat systems. While I love the things they've added to the combat itself, the systems are still pretty lacking, besides the materia. They have these party upgrade features that seem like they should be impactful, but I never really felt their power much besides the new synergy abilities you can pick up from them. What would really impress me is to see some kind of talent tree for each character that can meaningfully change the way you play them. But the change I want to see that I think would make the largest impact and bring the series to new heights is for Square to create a better open world to explore. The world they made in Rebirth is stunning to look at, but as I explained earlier, it's pretty mundane to explore gameplay-wise. I want to find more hidden secrets that give different rewards to tie back into the gameplay, even if it's something as simple as a new card for playing Queen's Blood. Hell, getting rewarded with cards for exploring would make me want to relentlessly search every nook and cranny of the world. But even better would be finding item upgrades that feel like they matter, like finding materials that improve your weapons, materia, and more. I want to run through a secret tunnel and find stuff on the ground that will make me feel stronger in combat. I do think if the next game finds a way to implement this kind of better exploration, the game will explode in popularity. But unfortunately, I don't expect the world exploration to change or improve a whole lot. But I would be very excited and impressed if it did. The other stuff like combat, I kind of expect to see get better. Even though there's a lot of areas where I think the game could grow, I think more than anything, Rebirth left me with a feeling of hope. Square is certainly doing something right with the care they've poured into this game. Because before the remake and Rebirth, I was getting truly worried I wouldn't see Square make another Final Fantasy game I would actually like. Both 15 and 16 were almost completely devoid of the luster that drew me to the series in the first place. Square revisiting 7 has rekindled these feelings. In fact, in many moments it brought them back in full. It makes me excited for the final installment of the 7 Remake series, but even more, I'm looking forward to what Square can come up with after this. Looming in the distant horizon past this next game, I can imagine this team making something even better. And it's exciting to think about what that's going to look like. Hopefully my expectations aren't too out of control. Anyways, that's all I've got for now, so thanks for watching and I hope to see you for the next one.
I won't say